Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and salt as Gorm, son of Harthacnut, made his way through the bustling port of Reeb. His weathered hand rested on the hilt of his sword, eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of threat. At just 25 winters, Gorm had already earned a reputation as a fierce warrior and cunning leader among the Danes of Jutland. As he approached the weather-beaten timber hall at the edge of town, a grizzled old man stumbled into his path, reeking of mead. "Watch where you're going, you old fool," Gorm growled, shoving the man aside. The old man's rheumy eyes suddenly cleared, fixing Gorm with an unsettling gaze. "Beware, son of Harthacnut," he croaked. "The Velva awaits you. Your destiny lies beyond those doors, but it comes with a price." Gorm's hand tightened on his sword. "Out of my way, drunkard, before I cut out your tongue for your insolence." The old man cackled and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Gorm unsettled. He shook off the encounter and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the hall. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the murmur of voices. Gorm's eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light, flickering shadows cast by dozens of candles dancing on the rough-hewn walls. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a high-backed chair, adorned with intricate carvings of ravens and wolves, sat Asgerd the seer. The Velva's piercing gaze seemed to look through Gorm, stripping away his carefully cultivated image of strength and bravado. He felt naked before her, vulnerable in a way that made his skin crawl. "Approach, Gorm, son of Harthacnut." Asgerd's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs in the hall. "The Norns have woven your fate into the tapestry of time, and I shall read the threads for you." Gorm strode forward, his chin held high, despite the unease churning in his gut. He would not show weakness before this woman, no matter her reputed powers. "I seek no fortune-telling witch," he spat. "I make my own destiny." Asgerd's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Do you now, young chieftain? Then why do you stand before me, your heart heavy with the weight of ambition and uncertainty?" Gorm's hand flew to his axe, but before he could draw it, Asgerd's eyes rolled back in her head. Her body began to convulse, and when she spoke again, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Listen well, son of Denmark, for the gods themselves speak through me," she intoned. "A crown of gold and blood awaits you, forged in the fires of conflict and tempered by wisdom. You shall be the first to unite the warring tribes of this land, but the price will be steep." Images flashed before Gorm's eyes. Battles fought and won, a golden crown placed upon his brow, and a woman of surpassing beauty standing by his side. But there was darkness too. Betrayal, loss, and a sacrifice so great it made his heart constrict with dread. As quickly as it began, the vision faded. Asgerd slumped in her chair, beads of sweat glistening on her brow. Gorm found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. What was that?" he demanded, struggling to his feet. Asgerd's eyes, now clear and focused, met his. "That, Gorm Harthacnutson, was your destiny. You are to be the first true king of Denmark, the one who will bring unity to this fractured land. But remember, with great power comes great sacrifice. Are you prepared to pay the price?" Gorm's mind reeled. He had always dreamed of power, of carving out a name for himself that would echo through the ages. But this was beyond his wildest imaginings. I need time to think," he muttered, turning to leave. "Time is a luxury you do not have, young king," Asgerd called after him. "Events are already in motion. Seek out the Lady Thyra of Jutland. In her you will find both your greatest strength and your greatest challenge." Gorm stumbled out of the hall, his head spinning with visions of glory and whispers of doom. He barely noticed the gathering crowd, their eyes wide with awe and fear at the sight of the shaken warrior. As he made his way back through the streets of Ribe, Gorm's mind raced. Could he truly unite the quarrelsome Danish tribes? And who was this Thyra that the Volva spoke of? His musings were interrupted by a commotion near the docks. A group of armed men surrounded a small party of richly dressed travelers. At their center stood a woman of breathtaking beauty, her golden hair gleaming in the sunlight, her bearing regal despite the danger surrounding her. "Stand aside, you dogs," she commanded, her voice clear and strong. "Do you not know who I am?" One of the attackers, a burly man with a scarred face, leered at her. "Oh, we know who you are, Lady Thyra, and we know your father will pay handsomely for your safe return." Gorm's heart leaped at the name. Could this be the woman Asgerd had spoken of? Without hesitation, he drew his sword and charged into the fray. "Unhand the lady," he roared, bringing his blade down on the nearest attacker. The fight was brief, but brutal. Gorm's skill with a blade was unmatched, and soon the would-be kidnappers lay dead or fleeing. He turned to the woman, who regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "I thank you for your timely intervention, stranger," she said, her voice cool and controlled. "May I know the name of my rescuer?" Gorm bowed slightly, never taking his eyes off her. "I am Gorm, son of Harthacnut, chieftain of the Jutes, and you, I believe, are the Lady Thyra of Jutland." Thyra's eyebrow arched elegantly. "You seem well informed, Gorm Harthacnutson. Tell me, what brings a Jutish chieftain to Ribe, and how do you come to know my name?" Gorm hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I was told to seek you out, by a Volva named Asgerd." Thyra's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. "Asgerd the seer? Her prophecies are not to be taken lightly. What did she tell you?" "She spoke of destiny, of a united Denmark," Gorm replied, his voice low. "And of you, my lady. She said that in you I would find both strength and challenge." A small smile played at the corners of Thyra's lips. "Did she now? And what do you make of this prophecy, Gorm of the Jutes?" Gorm met her gaze steadily. "I think, my lady, that we have much to discuss. Perhaps over a cup of mead?" Thyra regarded him for a long moment, as if weighing his worth. Finally she nodded. "Very well, Gorm Harthacnutson. Let us talk of destiny and kingdoms. But know this, I am no mere pawn to be moved about on the board of men's ambitions. If we are to forge an alliance, it will be as equals." As they made their way to a nearby mead hall, Gorm felt a sense of excitement and trepidation. The Volva's prophecy echoed in his mind, promises of glory intertwined with warnings of sacrifice. Whatever lay ahead, he knew that his life had irrevocably changed. With Thyra by his side, he would reshape the very fabric of Denmark, or die trying. The sun began to set over Ribe, casting long shadows across the town. In the gathering darkness, unseen eyes watched the pair, plotting and scheming. The game of power had begun, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of Denmark itself. The pre-dawn mist clung to the rolling hills of Jutland as Gorm stood atop the wooden palisade of his stronghold. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. It had been 3 moons since his fateful meeting with Thyra in Ribe, and the landscape of Danish politics had shifted dramatically in that short time. "My lord," a gruff voice called from below. Gorm looked down to see his most trusted huskarl, Bjorn Ironside, standing at attention. "The men are ready. We await your command." Gorm nodded, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Tell them to prepare for departure. We move on Jarl Sigtrygg's hall before the sun crests the horizon." As Bjorn hurried off to relay the orders, Gorm felt a presence beside him. Thyra, now his wife and closest advisor, stood wrapped in a thick fur cloak, her golden hair glinting in the pale light. "Are you certain this is wise, husband?" she asked, her voice low and measured. "Sigtryg has many allies. If we move against him openly, others may rally to his cause." Gorm turned to face her, his eyes blazing with determination. "We have no choice, Thyra. Sigtryg has been raiding our lands, stirring up dissent among the other jarls. If we are to unite Denmark, we must make an example of him." Thyra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then let us hope the gods favor us this day. I have made the proper sacrifices to Odin and Thor. May they grant you victory." As the war party assembled in the courtyard below, Gorm addressed his warriors. Their breath steamed in the cold morning air, faces set with grim determination. "Men of Jutland," Gorm's voice boomed across the gathering. "Today we take the first step towards a united Denmark. Jarl Sigtryg thinks us weak, divided. We will show him the error of his ways." A roar went up from the assembled warriors, axes and swords thrust skyward. Gorm raised his hand for silence. "But remember this. We fight not just for glory or plunder, but for a greater purpose. Every drop of blood spilled today brings us closer to a Denmark united and strong. Fight with honor, and the skalds will sing of your deeds for generations to come." With a final battle cry, Gorm led his men out of the stronghold and into the misty countryside. The thud of hooves and the jingle of mail filled the air as they rode hard towards Sigtrygg's hall. As they crested a hill overlooking their target, Gorm raised his hand, signaling the war party to halt. Below them, Sigtrygg's stronghold lay seemingly peaceful in the early morning light. But something was amiss. "It's too quiet," Bjorn muttered, his hand tightening on his axe. "Where are the sentries?" Gorm's eyes narrowed. "It's a trap. Sigtryg knew we were coming." No sooner had the words left his mouth than war horns blared from the surrounding forests. From all sides, warriors poured out of hiding, their weapons glinting in the rising sun. "Form shield wall!" Gorm roared, wheeling his horse around. "Archers to the center! We'll make our stand here!" The Danish warriors moved with practiced precision, forming a tight circle with their interlocking shields. Arrows whistled through the air, finding marks on both sides as Sigtrygg's forces charged up the hill. The clash of steel on steel filled the air as the two forces met. Gorm fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of motion as he cut down foe after foe. Beside him, Bjorn Ironside lived up to his name, his massive axe cleaving through shields and armor alike. But despite their valor, Gorm's men were outnumbered. Slowly but surely they were being pushed back, the circle of shields growing smaller with each passing moment. Just as all seemed lost, a familiar voice rang out across the battlefield. "For Denmark and Gorm." Thyra, resplendent in gleaming mail and helm, led a charge of fresh warriors from the rear of Sigtrygg's forces. The unexpected assault threw the enemy into disarray, and Gorm seized the moment. "Push forward," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Victory is within our grasp." With renewed vigor, Gorm's warriors surged forward. The tide of battle turned, and soon Sigtrygg's men were in full retreat. As the last of the enemy fled into the forests, Gorm found himself face to face with Jarl Sigtryg himself. The older man, his once fine clothes now stained with blood and mud, dropped to his knees before Gorm. "I yield," he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "Spare me, I beg you." Gorm raised his sword, every fiber of his being crying out for vengeance. But Thyra's hand on his arm stayed his blow. "Remember why we fight, my love," she said softly. "A united Denmark needs leaders, not martyrs." Gorm hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon. "Jarl Sigtryg," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent battlefield. "Your life is forfeit, but I choose to spare it. Swear fealty to me as the rightful king of Denmark, and you may keep your lands and title." Sigtrygg's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with calculation. After a moment, he bowed his head. "I, Jarl Sigtryg, do hereby swear fealty to Gorm, son of Harthacnut, as the true king of Denmark. May the gods strike me down if I break this oath." A cheer went up from Gorm's warriors, the sound echoing across the blood-soaked hillside. As the adrenaline of battle faded, Gorm felt the weight of his actions settle upon him. He had won a great victory, but at what cost? Later that evening, as Gorm's forces occupied Sigtrygg's hall, a celebration was in full swing. Mead flowed freely, and skalds were already composing verses about the day's battle. But Gorm found no joy in the revelry. He stood alone on the hall's balcony, looking out over the torchlit countryside. Thyra approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What troubles you, my king?" she asked. "We have won a great victory today." Gorm sighed heavily. "At what price, Thyra? How many good men died today for my ambition, and how many more will fall before Denmark is truly united?" Thyra's grip on his shoulder tightened. "The path to greatness is never easy, Gorm, but remember the prophecy. You are destined to bring peace and unity to this land. The lives lost today will save countless more in the future." Gorm turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "And what of the price we must pay? Asgerd spoke of a great sacrifice. What if it's more than I can bear?" Thyra cupped his face in her hands, her gaze unwavering. "Whatever comes, we will face it together. You are not alone in this, my love. I will be by your side, come what may." Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Bjorn Ironside, his face grave despite the victory. "My king," he said, bowing slightly. "We've received word from the coast. Norwegian longships have been sighted. It seems King Harald Fairhair has taken an interest in our little war." Gorm's jaw tightened. The unification of Denmark had only just begun, and already foreign powers were circling like vultures. He squared his shoulders, feeling the weight of the crown he did not yet wear. "So be it," he said, his voice filled with grim determination. "If Harald wants to test our mettle, we'll give him a fight he won't soon forget. Send word to all loyal jarls. It's time to show the world that Denmark stands united." As Bjorn hurried off to carry out his orders, Gorm turned back to the balcony. In the distance, he could see the first glimmers of dawn breaking over the horizon. A new day was dawning for Denmark, fraught with both peril and promise. With Thyra by his side, Gorm steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The road to a united Denmark would be long and bloody, but he was determined to see it through no matter the cost. The saga of Gorm the Old, first true king of Denmark, had only just begun. The great hall of Jelling buzzed with tension as Gorm paced before the ornate high seat, his brow furrowed in concentration. The flickering light from the central hearth cast long shadows across the faces of the assembled jarls and chieftains, each watching their king with a mixture of respect and wariness. "My lords," Gorm's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. "We face a grave threat. King Harald Fairhair of Norway has sent envoys to assess our strength and intentions. Make no mistake, this is no mere diplomatic mission. The Norwegians seek to exploit our recent conflicts for their own gain." Jarl Styrbjorn, a grizzled veteran of countless raids, spoke up. "Let them come. We'll send these Norwegian dogs back to their longships with their tails between their legs." A chorus of agreement rose from several of the assembled leaders, but Thyra, seated beside the high seat, raised her hand for silence. "Brave words, Jarl Styrbjorn," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "But let us not underestimate our foe. Harald Fairhair has united Norway under his rule. He commands vast resources and battle-hardened warriors. We must be cautious in our approach." Gorm nodded, grateful for his wife's counsel. "Queen Thyra speaks wisely. We cannot afford to provoke a war with Norway, while our own unification is still fragile. We must show strength, yes, but also cunning." As the assembly debated strategies, the doors of the great hall burst open. A young warrior, his clothes travel-stained and face flushed with exertion, rushed in and fell to one knee before Gorm. "My king," he gasped, catching his breath. "The Norwegian envoys approach. They'll be at our gates within the hour." Gorm's eyes narrowed. "So soon? They mean to catch us off guard. Very well. We shall give them a welcome they won't soon forget. Thyra, See to the preparations for a feast. Jarls, don your finest clothes and jewelry. We'll show these Norwegians the wealth and unity of Denmark." As the hall erupted into a flurry of activity, Gorm pulled Thyra aside. "What news from our friends in Norway?" he asked in a low voice. Thyra's lips curved into a sly smile. "Our spies report that all is not well in Harold's kingdom. His son Eric Bloodaxe grows restless and ambitious. We may be able to use this to our advantage." Gorm nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "Good. Keep me informed of any developments. Now, let us prepare to receive our guests." An hour later, Gorm sat upon his high seat, resplendent in a cloak of rich fur and a golden arm ring that glinted in the firelight. Thyra stood beside him, her beauty enhanced by a gown of fine silk and a necklace of amber and silver. The hall was filled with the cream of Danish nobility, each striving to outdo the others in displays of wealth and martial prowess. The doors swung open, and the Norwegian envoys were ushered in. At their head strode a tall, imposing man with a shock of red hair and a beard to match. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in every detail of the hall. "Hail, Gorm, son of Harthacnut," the man's voice boomed across the hall. "I am Hakon, emissary of King Harold Fairhair of Norway. We bring greetings and curiosity about the recent events in your lands." Gorm rose, his face a mask of regal composure. "Welcome, Hakon of Norway. Denmark is honored by your visit. Come, break bread with us and share in our bounty. We have much to discuss." As the feast commenced, the air thick with the aroma of roasted meats and the sound of skalds reciting ancient verses, Gorm kept a watchful eye on the Norwegian delegation. Hakon, for his part, seemed more interested in assessing the strength of the Danish forces than in diplomatic niceties. "Tell me, King Gorm," Hakon said between bites of succulent roast pork, "how fares your campaign to unite the Danish lands? We hear tales of great battles and shifting allegiances." Gorm smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Denmark prospers under united rule, Hakon. Our people are strong, our warriors fierce, and our lands bountiful. But surely you didn't sail all this way to discuss internal Danish affairs." Hakon's eyes glinted. "Indeed not. King Harold is concerned about the balance of power in the North Sea. He seeks assurances that Denmark's ambitions do not extend beyond its current borders." Before Gorm could respond, the hall's doors burst open once more. A figure strode in, tall and proud, his cloak billowing behind him. The assembled Danes gasped in recognition and surprise. "Eric Bloodaxe," Thyra whispered, her hand gripping Gorm's arm tightly. The son of Harold Fairhair surveyed the scene with barely concealed disdain. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "What a quaint little gathering. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Hakon's face had gone pale. "Prince Eric," he stammered, rising to his feet. We were not expecting you." Eric's laugh was sharp and mirthless. "Clearly not. Tell me, Hakon, does my father know you're here playing at diplomacy while real men do the fighting?" Gorm stood, his mind racing to adapt to this unexpected turn of events. "Prince Eric of Norway," he said, his voice steady, "you are welcome in our hall. Please join us at the high table. We have much to discuss." As Eric swaggered towards the high seat, Gorm exchanged a quick glance with Thyra. This was a dangerous game they now played, with the future of Denmark hanging in the balance. The feast resumed, but with a palpable undercurrent of tension. Eric drank heavily, his tongue loosened by mead and bravado. "You Danes," he slurred, pointing an accusatory finger at Gorm. "You think you can unite your petty kingdoms and challenge Norwegian supremacy? Ha! We'll crush you like the insects you are." Gorm's warriors bristled at the insult, hands moving to weapon hilts. But Gorm raised a hand, silencing them. "Strong words, Prince Eric," he said calmly. "But tell me, how fares your father these days? I hear whispers that all is not well in the court of Harold Fairhair." Eric's face darkened with rage. He lurched to his feet, sending his drinking horn clattering to the floor. "You dare?" he roared. "I'll have your head for that, you Danish dog." In an instant, the hall erupted into chaos. Warriors on both sides drew weapons, shouts and curses filling the air. Gorm stood, his own sword in hand, ready to defend his hall and his people. But before blood could be shed, a piercing shriek cut through the tumult. All eyes turned to see Asgerd the seer. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her body convulsing as if in the grip of some otherworldly force. "Beware," she cried, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Beware the sons of the north. Blood calls to blood, and the ravens feast on the fallen. The fate of kingdoms hangs in the balance, and only the true peacemaker can stem the tide of war." A hush fell over the hall as Asgerd collapsed, caught by nearby attendants. In the stunned silence that followed, Gorm seized the moment. "Enough," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "We are not animals to brawl over scraps. We are Northmen, bound by ancient ties of kinship and honor. Let us put aside our differences and seek a path that benefits all our peoples." Eric, sobered by the vulva's pronouncement, slowly lowered his weapon. Håkon, seeing an opportunity, stepped forward. "King Gorm speaks wisely," he said, his diplomatic training reasserting itself. "Perhaps it is time we return to Norway and reassess our position. Prince Eric, will you accompany us?" Eric glowered but nodded curtly. As the Norwegians prepared to depart, Gorm approached Eric, speaking low so only the prince could hear. "Remember this day, Eric Bloodaxe," he said, his eyes boring into the younger man's. "For it may come to pass that you will need allies in the days ahead. Denmark's hand is open to friendship, or clenched for war. The choice will be yours." As the Norwegian delegation rode out of Jelling, Gorm and Thyra stood on the ramparts, watching them disappear into the gathering dusk. "That was too close," Thyra murmured. "Eric's rashness could have undone all we've worked for." Gorm nodded, his face grim. "True, but it has also shown us the cracks in Norwegian unity. We must be prepared for what comes next. The game of kingdoms has only just begun." As night fell over Jelling, Gorm retired to his private chambers, the weight of kingship heavy on his shoulders. The prophecy of unity and the warnings of sacrifice echoed in his mind. Whatever trials lay ahead, he knew that the fate of Denmark, and perhaps all of Scandinavia, would be decided in the crucible of the coming days. The salty sea breeze whipped through Gorm's beard as he stood at the prow of the longship, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The coast of England loomed in the distance, a land of both opportunity and danger. Behind him, a small fleet of Danish ships followed, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the choppy waters of the North Sea. "Land ho!" came the cry from the lookout. Gorm's grip tightened on the gunwale, his mind racing with the possibilities and perils that awaited them on English shores. As they approached the coast, Gorm turned to address his chosen emissaries. Among them stood Halfdan the Wise, a seasoned diplomat, and Astrid Ravnsdottir, a sharp-minded shield maiden known for her quick wit. "Remember," Gorm said, his voice low and intense, "we come not as raiders but as envoys. Our goal is to establish trade and potential alliances. The future of Denmark may well depend on the outcome of this mission." Halfdan nodded solemnly. "We understand, my king. But what of the Anglo-Saxons? They may not welcome us with open arms, given our people's, history with their lands." Gorm's eyes hardened. "Then we shall have to change their minds. Denmark is entering a new era, and it's time the rest of the world recognized it." As their ships beached on the pebbly shore, they were met by a contingent of armed Anglo-Saxon thengs. Their leader, a burly man with a thick mustache, stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of his sword. "Halt, Northmen," he called out in accented Norse. "State your business in the lands of King Ethelstan, or be prepared to taste English steel." Gorm raised his hands in a gesture of peace, stepping forward to meet the Anglo-Saxon leader. "I am Gorm, King of Denmark. We come in peace, seeking audience with your king to discuss matters of trade and alliance." The Thegn's eyes narrowed suspiciously, King of Denmark, you say? We've heard rumors of unification in the north, but... He paused, considering. Very well. You may come with us to Winchester, but be warned. Any sign of treachery, and your heads will adorn our city walls. As they journeyed inland, Gorm and his party observed the English countryside with keen interest. Fields of wheat and barley stretched as far as the eye could see, interspersed with small villages and the occasional stone church. Astrid rode up beside Gorm, her voice low. My king, have you noticed the number of Christian churches? The new faith seems to have taken strong root here. Gorm nodded, his brow furrowed. Indeed. We must tread carefully. The Christians are not always welcoming to those who still honor the old gods. After several days of travel, they arrived at Winchester, the seat of King Ethelstan's power. The city bustled with activity, its streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and clerics from across Europe. As they were led into the great hall, Gorm couldn't help but be impressed by the grandeur of the Anglo-Saxon court. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes and great battles adorned the walls, while ornate silver candelabras cast a warm glow over the assembled nobles. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne of intricately carved oak, sat King Ethelstan. His piercing blue eyes seemed to take in every detail as Gorm and his party approached. So, Ethelstan's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs of his court. The King of Denmark graces us with his presence. Tell me, Gorm Harathacnutson, what brings you to our shores? Surely not another raid? Gorm met Ethelstan's gaze steadily. Nay, King Ethelstan, we come seeking friendship and mutual prosperity. Denmark is changing, and we wish to forge new bonds with our neighbors. Ethelstan leaned forward, intrigued. Fine words, but words are wind. What exactly do you propose? For the next several hours, Gorm and his advisors engaged in intense negotiations with Ethelstan and his counselors. They discussed trade routes, tariffs, and the possibility of military alliances against common threats. As the talks progressed, Gorm became increasingly aware of the complex political landscape in England. Ethelstan, it seemed, faced challenges to his rule from rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the ever-present threat of Viking incursions. During a brief recess, Halfdan pulled Gorm aside. My king, he whispered urgently. I've overheard whispers among the English nobles. There's talk of Viking settlements in a place called Normandy across the Channel. It seems a Norse leader named Rollo has carved out a significant territory there. Gorm's eyes widened at this news. The possibilities it presented were both exciting and concerning. Interesting. This could change the balance of power in the region. We must learn more. As the negotiations resumed, Gorm subtly steered the conversation towards the situation in Normandy. Ethelstan's reaction was guarded but revealing. Ah, so you've heard of Duke Rollo and his arrangement with the Frankish king? Ethelstan said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. It seems the Northmen are determined to leave their mark on all corners of Europe. Gorm leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. Perhaps this presents a chance for both our kingdoms, King Ethelstan. A united Denmark could help stabilize the North Sea, acting as a buffer against further Viking expansion. In return, we seek favorable trade agreements and recognition of our sovereignty. Ethelstan stroked his beard thoughtfully. A bold proposal, King Gorm. But how can we trust that Denmark won't simply become another threat to England's shores? It was Astrid who spoke up, her voice clear and confident. My Lord Ethelstan, consider the changing tides of history. The age of mindless raiding is coming to an end. Denmark seeks to build, not to destroy. An alliance between our nations could usher in an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity for both our peoples. Her words seemed to strike a chord with Ethelstan and his advisors. After further discussion and debate, a tentative agreement was reached. Denmark would be granted favorable trading rights in English ports, and in return, would pledge to help curb Viking raids on English shores. As the formal negotiations concluded, Ethelstan invited Gorm to join him for a private conversation in the royal gardens. As they walked among the carefully tended roses and herbs, Ethelstan's demeanor softened, "I must admit, Gorm," he said, his voice low, "I had my doubts about this meeting, but you've shown yourself to be a man of vision. Tell me, what drove you to pursue this path of unification and diplomacy?" Gorm was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I've seen the toll that constant warfare and raiding takes on our people," he finally said. "The glory of battle fades, but the scars remain. I believe there's a better way forward, one that brings prosperity to all our people, not just the lucky few who survive each raid." Ethelstan nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "A noble goal, and one I can respect. But be warned, Gorm of Denmark. The path you've chosen is not an easy one. There will be those who resist change, both in your lands and beyond." "I'm well aware of the challenges," Gorm replied, his jaw set with determination. "But the future of Denmark, of all our lands, is worth the struggle." As they prepared to depart Winchester, laden with gifts and the promise of future cooperation, Gorm felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. They had achieved more than he had dared hope, but he knew that the real challenges lay ahead. On the voyage back to Denmark, as the English coast faded into the distance, Gorm gathered his advisors on the deck of his longship. "We've taken a great step forward," he declared, his voice carrying over the sound of wind and waves. "But our work is far from done. The news of Normandy changes everything. We must be prepared for the shifts in power that are coming." Halfdan spoke up, his face grave. "My king, what of the Christian influence we saw in England? Should we be concerned about its spread to our lands?" Gorm's brow furrowed. It was a question he had been pondering since their arrival in Winchester. "We must be cautious," he said slowly. "The new faith brings both opportunities and challenges. For now, we'll maintain our traditions, but we must also be open to change if we're to secure our place in this new world." As Denmark's shores came into view, Gorm felt the weight of his responsibilities more keenly than ever. The expedition to England had opened new doors, but it had also revealed the complexity of the game they now played. Unifying Denmark was just the beginning. To secure their future, they would need to navigate the treacherous waters of European politics with skill and foresight. With Thyra's wisdom, the loyalty of his followers, and the blessings of the gods, Gorm steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The saga of Denmark's rise was far from over, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The air was thick with tension as Gorm stood atop the wooden watchtower of Hedeby, his eyes scanning the horizon. The bustling trade town, strategically located at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, had become the focal point of Danish politics. News of Gorm's growing power and his diplomatic successes in England had spread like wildfire, igniting both hope and fear throughout the land. Beside him, Thyra's voice cut through his thoughts. "They're coming, aren't they?" Gorm nodded grimly. "Aye. Our scouts report that Jarl Ivar Bloodhand has rallied a coalition of rival chieftains. They mean to end our dream of a united Denmark here and now." Thyra's hand found his, squeezing it reassuringly. "Then we shall meet them with all the strength and cunning we possess. Denmark's future hangs in the balance." As they descended the tower, they were met by Bjorn Ironside, his face etched with concern. "My king, my queen, the enemy forces are larger than we anticipated. They outnumber us nearly 2-1. Gorm's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Numbers aren't everything, old friend. We have the advantage of preparation and position, and we have something they lack, a cause worth fighting for." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as Gorm and his advisors finalized their battle plans. The defenses of Hedeby were strengthened, and every able-bodied man and woman was armed and assigned a position. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, the first signs of the enemy army appeared on the horizon. Gorm gathered his forces before the main gate of Hedeby, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Men and women of Denmark, today we fight not just for our lives, but for the very soul of our nation. For too long we have been divided, easy prey for foreign invaders and petty tyrants. But no more. Today we stand united against those who would keep us weak and fractured." A cheer went up from the assembled warriors, the clash of weapons against shields echoing across the battlefield. "Remember," Gorm continued, his eyes blazing with intensity, "we fight not just for glory or plunder, but for a future where our children can grow up in peace and prosperity. A future where Denmark stands proud and united among the nations of the world." As the enemy forces drew nearer, Gorm turned to Thyra. "You should retreat to the safety of the inner keep," he said softly. Thyra's eyes flashed defiantly. "My place is here, by your side. I may not wield a sword, but I have other weapons at my disposal." Before Gorm could argue further, a horn blast signaled the enemy's approach. The rival coalition, led by the fearsome Jarl Ivar Bloodhand, had arrived in force. Their battle lines stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of glinting armor and sharp steel. Ivar's voice boomed across the field, dripping with contempt. "Gorm Harathik Knutson, your dreams of kingship end here. Surrender now, and we may yet spare your miserable life." Gorm stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying. "And who are you to demand my surrender, Ivar? A petty jarl clinging to the old ways, too blind to see the future that lies before us? I offer you one chance. Join us in building a stronger Denmark, or fall with the other relics of our divided past." Ivar's face contorted with rage. "Enough talk. Men of the old ways, attack. Let us send this upstart and his followers to the halls of Valhalla." With a thunderous roar, the enemy forces charged forward. Gorm's warriors met them head-on, the clash of steel on steel filling the air. The battle for Denmark's future had begun in earnest. As the fighting raged, Gorm found himself in the thick of the melee, his sword a blur of motion as he cut down foe after foe. Beside him, Bjorn Ironside lived up to his name, his massive axe cleaving through enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency. But despite their valor, the sheer numbers of the enemy began to tell. Slowly but surely, Gorm's forces were being pushed back towards the gates of Hedeby. In a moment of respite, Gorm found himself back-to-back with Bjorn, both men breathing heavily. "It's not looking good, my king," Bjorn grunted, parrying a vicious sword thrust. "We can't hold them much longer." Gorm's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then, through the chaos of battle, he spotted something that made his heart leap. A familiar figure moving through the enemy ranks, a hood pulled low over her face. "Thyra," he whispered, a mixture of fear and awe in his voice. Before he could call out to her, a thick fog began to roll across the battlefield, seemingly out of nowhere. The fighting slowed as visibility dropped to mere feet, confusion spreading through both armies. Then, cutting through the mist, came an unearthly shriek. Gorm recognized it immediately, the voice of Asgerd the Seer. "Behold!" Her voice echoed unnaturally across the battlefield. "The gods themselves intervene. Those who fight against the unification of Denmark fight against the will of Odin himself." In the eerie silence that followed, Gorm seized his chance. "Warriors of Denmark!" he roared. "The All-Father has shown his favor. Now is the time to strike. For unity. For Denmark." With renewed vigor, Gorm's forces surged forward. The fog, whether by divine intervention or clever trickery, had thrown the enemy into disarray. Gorm led a daring flanking maneuver, cutting through the confused enemy ranks like a hot knife through butter. As the mist began to clear, Gorm found himself face to face with Jarl Ivar Bloodhand. The rival leader's eyes widened in shock as he realized how the tide had turned. "It's over, Ivar," Gorm said, his sword leveled at the Jarl's throat. "Yield, and let us end this bloodshed." For a moment, it seemed Ivar might fight to the bitter end. But as he looked around and saw his forces in retreat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I yield," he muttered, dropping his axe. "The day is yours, Gorm. Or should I say, King Gorm of Denmark." As word of Ivar's surrender spread, the remaining enemy forces threw down their weapons. The Battle of Hedeby was over, and with it, The last major obstacle to Danish unification had fallen. In the aftermath of the battle, as the wounded were tended to and the dead honored, Gorm sought out Thyra. He found her with Asgerd, both women looking exhausted but triumphant. That was a risky gambit, Gorm said, embracing his wife. But by Odin's beard, it worked. Thyra smiled wearily. Sometimes, my love, the appearance of divine intervention can be more powerful than the real thing. The fog was Asgerd's doing, but the rest, well, men see what they expect to see in the heat of battle. Gorm shook his head in amazement. You never cease to surprise me, my queen. Denmark owes you a great debt this day. As the sun set on the bloodied fields around Hedeby, Gorm gathered his advisors and the surrendered jarls in the great hall. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and healing herbs, the room packed with warriors still flushed with victory or nursing their wounds. The time for division is over, Gorm declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Today, we have proven that together, we are stronger than any force that stands against us. I offer you all a choice. Join me in building a united Denmark, a land of peace and prosperity for all our people, or cling to the old ways and be left behind by history. One by one, the defeated jarls stepped forward to pledge their allegiance. Even Ivar Bloodhand, his pride battered but not broken, knelt before Gorm. I may not agree with all your ideas, Ivar growled, but I cannot deny the strength of your vision. My axe is yours, King Gorm, for as long as you stay true to your word. As the impromptu ceremony concluded, Gorm felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The dream of a united Denmark, which had seemed so distant just days ago, was now within reach. But as he caught Thyra's eye across the crowded hall, he saw his own mix of triumph and trepidation reflected there. They had won a great victory, but the real challenges of rulership were only just beginning. Outside the hall, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, the fires of the battlefield still smoldered, a reminder of the cost of unity. Gorm took a deep breath, savoring the taste of victory tinged with the responsibility of what was to come. The Battle of Hedeby had changed everything. Denmark was united, but the saga of Gorm the Old, the peacemaker king, was far from over. The eyes of the world were now upon them, and the true test of their vision for a new Denmark was about to begin. The sun rose over Jelling, casting a golden glow on the newly erected wooden palisades surrounding the royal seat. In the months following the Battle of Hedeby, Gorm had wasted no time in consolidating his power and establishing Jelling as the heart of his unified kingdom. As dawn broke, the sound of hammering and sawing already filled the air. Craftsmen from across Denmark labored to construct a grand hall befitting the first true king of a united realm. Gorm stood atop a half-finished watchtower, surveying the bustling activity below. Bjorn Ironside approached, his face etched with concern. My king, the Jarls are assembling for the thing. They're restless. Gorm nodded grimly. As well they might be. Change never comes easily, especially to those accustomed to power. As they made their way to the makeshift assembly ground, Gorm could feel the weight of expectation pressing down upon him. The thing, a traditional assembly of free men to discuss laws and settle disputes, would be his first true test as ruler of all Denmark. The gathering was a sea of faces, some familiar, others still wary and untrusting. Gorm took his place at the center, Thyra by his side, her presence a calming influence amidst the tension. Men of Denmark, Gorm began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. We stand at the dawn of a new era. For too long, our people have been divided, easy prey for raiders and foreign powers. But no more. United, we have the strength to forge our own destiny. A murmur of approval rippled through the assembly, but it was quickly silenced as Jarl Styrbjorn, an old rival, stepped forward. Fine words, Gorm Harathak Knutson, Styrbjorn sneered. But what of our ancient rights? Will you rule as a tyrant, stripping away the powers of the Jarls who have led our people for generations? Gorm met Styrbjorn's gaze steadily. I have no desire to be a tyrant, Jarl Styrbjorn. But neither can we cling to old ways that weaken us. I propose a new system, a council of Jarls to advise the king, with each region maintaining a measure of autonomy while contributing to the strength of the whole. The assembly erupted into heated debate. Some Jarls saw the wisdom in Gorm's proposal, while others clung fiercely to their traditional powers. As the arguments grew more heated, Thyra stepped forward, her voice cutting through the clamor. "My lords," she said, her tone both respectful and commanding. "Consider the alternative. We can either adapt and grow stronger together, or we can squabble amongst ourselves until some foreign power decides to take advantage of our weakness. The choice is yours." Her words seemed to strike a chord, and gradually a consensus began to form. By midday, the outline of a new governing structure for Denmark had been hammered out. It wasn't perfect, and some Jarls still grumbled, but it was a start. As the assembly dispersed, Gorm felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. A messenger approached, breathless with urgency. "My king," he gasped. "Queen Thyra. She's gone into labor." Gorm's heart leaped into his throat. He raced towards the royal quarters, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. As he burst into the chamber, he found Thyra surrounded by midwives, her face contorted in pain. "Gorm," she managed through gritted teeth, reaching out for his hand. "I'm glad you're here." For hours, Gorm remained by Thyra's side as she labored to bring their child into the world. Outside, a crowd gathered, anxiously awaiting news of the birth that would secure the future of Denmark's new royal line. As night fell, a piercing cry cut through the air. The midwife turned to Gorm, a bundle in her arms. "My king," she said, beaming, "you have a son." Gorm took the child with trembling hands, marveling at the tiny life he now held. "Harold," he whispered, recalling the name they had chosen. "Welcome to the world, my son." The news of Prince Harold's birth spread quickly, and celebrations erupted across Jelling and beyond. Bonfires were lit, and toasts were raised to the health of the new prince and the future of Denmark. But amidst the joy, a shadow fell across Gorm's heart. As he cradled his newborn son, Asgerd the seer appeared in the doorway, her eyes distant and unfocused. "The threads of fate are woven tight," she intoned, her voice eerily calm. "A great destiny awaits the child, but beware, King Gorm. The price of power is often paid in blood and sorrow." Before Gorm could question her further, Asgerd vanished, leaving behind a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. Days passed, and as Thyra regained her strength, Gorm found himself grappling with the weight of his new responsibilities. The challenges of uniting Denmark were proving to be more complex than he had anticipated. One morning, as he sat in his newly constructed great hall poring over reports from across the kingdom, a commotion outside caught his attention. He emerged to find a group of men in unfamiliar robes, led by a tall, austere figure carrying a wooden cross. "Who are you?" Gorm demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. The leader stepped forward, bowing slightly. "I am Father Ansgar, my lord. We are missionaries, sent by the Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen to bring the light of Christ to these lands." Gorm's eyes narrowed. He had heard of the Christian faith during his dealings with England, but to have missionaries here in the heart of Denmark, it was a complication he hadn't foreseen. "And what makes you think we need your light, priest?" Gorm asked, his voice cold. Father Ansgar met his gaze unflinchingly. "The old gods are fading, King Gorm. The future belongs to those who embrace the one true God. Many of your people already hunger for the salvation we offer." Before Gorm could respond, a voice rang out from the crowd that had gathered. "He speaks the truth, my king." A man stepped forward, his face earnest. "I have heard the Christian message, and it brings peace to my heart in a way the old gods never did." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others scowling in disapproval. Gorm felt the beginnings of a headache forming behind his eyes. This was a powder keg waiting to explode. "Enough," he said, raising his hand for silence. "Father Ansgar, you and your missionaries may stay for now. But know this, any attempt to forcibly convert my people or disrupt the peace of this kingdom will be met with swift punishment." As the crowd dispersed, Gorm retreated to the privacy of his chambers, his mind racing. He found Thera there, nursing young Harold. "You heard?" he asked, sinking into a chair. Thyra nodded, her face grave. "This Christian faith, it could tear Denmark apart if we're not careful." Gorm ran a hand through his beard, feeling the weight of the crown he did not yet physically wear. "We must find a way to balance the old and the new. Denmark cannot afford to be torn apart by religious strife, not when we've only just achieved unity." As if sensing the tension in the room, Harold began to fuss. Thyra soothed him gently, then looked up at Gorm with determination in her eyes. "We will find a way, my love. We've faced greater challenges than this and prevailed." Gorm nodded, drawing strength from her confidence. But as he gazed out the window at the bustling town below, he couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest tests of his reign were yet to come. That night, as Gorm lay sleepless in bed, the words of Asgerd's prophecy echoed in his mind. The price of power, paid in blood and sorrow. What sacrifices would he be called upon to make for the sake of Denmark's future? As dawn broke, Gorm rose, his resolve hardened. Whatever challenges lay ahead, religious strife, foreign threats, or the machinations of ambitious jarls, he would face them head-on. For the sake of Denmark, for Thyra, and for little Harold, he would bear the burden of kingship, no matter the cost. The sun rose over Jelling, casting long shadows across the land. In the distance, the first stones of what would become the great Jelling monuments were being laid, a testament to the birth of a unified Denmark and the dawn of a new era. Gorm stood at the window watching as his people went about their daily lives. Farmers tending their fields, craftsmen at their forges, merchants preparing for the day's trade. They were all counting on him now, whether they knew it or not. "I will not fail them," he whispered to himself, a solemn vow carried away by the morning breeze. "Whatever the cost, Denmark will prosper." With a deep breath, King Gorm the Old squared his shoulders and stepped out to face another day of challenges, decisions, and the heavy responsibility of shaping the future of a nation. The saga of Denmark's unification was far from over, but with each passing day, the dream of a strong, united kingdom grew ever closer to reality. The autumn wind howled across the fjords of Denmark, carrying with it the scent of salt and the promise of a harsh winter to come. In the great hall of Jelling, King Gorm sat upon his high seat, his brow furrowed as he listened to the reports from his scouts. "My king," said Halfdan, his most trusted spy, "the rumors are true. A new power is rising in the Baltic. They call themselves the Vikings." Gorm leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Tell me more of these Vikings." Halfdan's voice lowered, as if afraid the very walls might be listening. "They are an elite brotherhood of warriors, my lord, bound by a strict code and answerable to no king or jarl. Their fortress, Jomsborg, is said to be impregnable." Thyra, seated beside Gorm, spoke up. "And what threat do they pose to Denmark?" "That's just it, my queen," Halfdan replied. "They could be either our greatest ally or our most dangerous enemy. Their strength grows by the day, and many young warriors from across the north are flocking to join their ranks." Gorm stood, pacing before the great hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of worry etched there. "We cannot ignore this. If the Vikings continue to grow unchecked, they could upset the balance of power we've worked so hard to establish." Turning to his advisors, Gorm's voice rang with authority. "Prepare a delegation. We sail for Jomsborg within the week." The journey to Jomsborg was treacherous. Autumn storms lashed at their longships, and more than once, Gorm feared they would be dashed against the rocky coast. But as they rounded the final headland, the sight that greeted them made the perilous voyage worth it. Jomsborg rose from the mists like something out of legend. Massive stone walls, higher than any Gorm had ever seen, surrounded a sprawling fortress. Longships by the dozens were moored in the protected harbor, their dragon heads seeming to watch the approaching Danish vessels with wary eyes. As they drew closer, a horn blast echoed across the water. A group of warriors, resplendent in gleaming mail and horned helms, awaited them on the docks. Gorm stepped ashore, Thyra and his honor guard close behind. A tall, scarred warrior stepped forward, his ice-blue eyes appraising the Danish king. "I am Palnatoke, leader of the Jomsvikings," he said, his voice as hard as the steel of his axe. "What brings the king of Denmark to our humble fortress?" Gorm met Palnatoke's gaze unflinchingly. "I come seeking alliance, Palnatoke of Jomsborg. Denmark would be honored to count the Jomsvikings among its friends." A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled warriors. Palnatoke's expression remained impassive. "Fine words, King Gorm, but the Jomsvikings bow to no crown. What makes you think we need your friendship?" Before Gorm could respond, Thyra stepped forward. "Because, mighty Palnatoke, the winds of change are blowing across the north. Denmark stands at the forefront of a new era, one of trade and prosperity. Ally with us, and the riches of a united Scandinavia could be within your grasp." Palnatoke's eyes narrowed, a glimmer of interest visible beneath his stern exterior. "Pretty words, my lady. But the Jomsvikings deal in steel, not silver. If you seek our allegiance, you must prove your worth." "Name your challenge," Gorm said without hesitation. A wolfish grin spread across Palnatoke's face. "3 trials, King of Denmark. Survive them, and we'll consider your offer of alliance." The first trial came at dawn the next day. Gorm found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, the angry sea churning far below. Palnatoke stood beside him, pointing to a small island some distance away. "Swim to the island and back," the Jomsviking leader said. "Prove you have the strength to lead men into battle." Without a word, Gorm stripped to his breeches and dove into the icy waters. The cold hit him like a hammer blow, threatening to drive the air from his lungs. But he pressed on, his powerful strokes carrying him through the choppy seas. As he hauled himself back onto the shore of Jomsborg, gasping for breath, he saw a newfound respect in the eyes of the watching Jomsvikings. The second trial tested Gorm's skill with weapons. He faced off against 3 of Jomsborg's finest warriors in single combat. Though outnumbered, Gorm's years of experience and tactical mind served him well. When the dust settled, he stood victorious, bleeding from several cuts, but unbowed. As night fell, Palnatoke announced the final trial. "A test of will, King Gorm. You must walk across burning coals while reciting the names of your ancestors, falter in step or word, and you fail." Gorm steeled himself as he approached the glowing bed of coals. Taking a deep breath, he began to walk, his voice strong and clear as he recited the lineage of Danish kings. The pain was excruciating, but he forced himself to focus on the names, on the weight of history and responsibility they carried. As he stepped off the coals, his feet blistered but his spirit unbroken, a cheer went up from the assembled Jomsvikings. Even Palnatoke looked impressed. "You have proven your worth, Gorm of Denmark," the Jomsviking leader declared. "Few men could have passed these trials. We will hear your proposal of alliance." The negotiations lasted for days. Gorm and Thyra worked tirelessly to craft an agreement that would benefit both Denmark and the Jomsvikings. Finally, as the sun set on the 5th day, terms were reached. "The Jomsvikings will stand as Denmark's strong right arm," Palnatoke proclaimed. "In times of war, our axes will be yours to command. In return, we maintain our independence and receive a share of Danish trade wealth." Gorm nodded, relief and triumph warring in his chest. "Agreed. Let this be the beginning of a new era of cooperation between our peoples." As they prepared to seal the alliance with a feast, Palnatoke pulled Gorm aside. "There is one more thing, King of Denmark. A pledge to ensure the lasting nature of our bond." Gorm's eyes narrowed. "What kind of pledge?" Palnatoke's gaze was cold and calculating. "Your son, the young Prince Harold." When he comes of age, he will serve a term with the Vikings. He will learn our ways, fight alongside us. This will cement the ties between our peoples for generations to come. Gorm felt as if he'd been struck. The thought of sending his only son, still just a babe in arms, to this brutal brotherhood. But as he looked around at the fortress, at the fierce warriors who could tip the balance of power in the north, he knew he had no choice. "Very well," Gorm said, his voice heavy. "When Harold reaches his 15th year, he will come to Jomsborg." As they sailed back to Denmark, the weight of Gorm's decision pressed heavily upon him. Thyra, sensing his turmoil, came to stand beside him at the ship's prow. "We had no choice," she said softly. The alliance with the Vikings could secure Denmark's future for generations. Gorm nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know. But at what cost, Thyra? What kind of man will our son become under their tutelage?" Thyra's hand found his, squeezing gently. "He will become the man Denmark needs him to be. Strong enough to face the challenges that lie ahead, yet tempered by the wisdom we will instill in him before he goes." As Yelling came into view, Gorm felt a renewed sense of purpose. The alliance with the Vikings was a gamble, but one that could pay off immensely for Denmark's future, and yet the price. Asgerd's prophecy echoed in his mind. The price of power is often paid in blood and sorrow. In the years to come, as young Harold grew from a babe to a boy, Gorm often found himself watching his son with a mixture of pride and trepidation. The future of Denmark rested on those small shoulders, shoulders that would one day bear the weight of mail and the responsibility of kingship. As he tucked Harold into bed one night, the boy's eyes wide with excitement over tales of Viking adventures, Gorm made a silent vow. He would prepare his son as best he could for the challenges that lay ahead. Harold would go to the Vikings not as a hostage, but as a prince of Denmark, ready to learn and to lead. The saga of Gorm the Old continued, each decision, each alliance bringing Denmark closer to its destiny as a unified and powerful kingdom. But as the winds of change swept across the north, Gorm knew that the greatest challenges, and perhaps the greatest sacrifices, still lay ahead. The great hall of Yelling buzzed with tension as Gorm paced before the assembled jarls and chieftains. The flickering firelight cast long shadows across the worried faces of Denmark's most powerful men. Outside, the winter wind howled, as if echoing the turmoil within. "My lords," Gorm's voice cut through the murmurs, "the news from England is grave. A vast army of our Norse and Danish kinsmen has landed on their shores. They call it the Great Heathen Army, and its leaders seek nothing less than the conquest of all England." Jarl Sigurd Snakeeye, a grizzled veteran of many raids, leaned forward eagerly. "This is our chance, my king. With England weakened, we could join this army and carve out rich lands for ourselves. Think of the glory, the wealth." A chorus of agreement rose from several of the assembled leaders, but Gorm raised his hand for silence. "And what of Denmark?" he asked, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. "What becomes of all we've built if we abandon our homeland for foreign conquests?" Thyra, seated beside the high seat, spoke up. "My husband speaks wisely. We've only just begun to taste the fruits of unity. To throw it all away now for the promise of English gold would be folly." The hall erupted into heated debate. Some argued passionately for joining the Great Heathen Army, while others cautioned restraint. As the arguments grew more heated, the doors of the hall burst open, admitting a gust of cold wind and a snow-covered figure. "My king!" the messenger gasped, falling to one knee before Gorm. "Word from our spies in Norway. King Harold Fairhair sees our indecision as weakness. He masses his forces, ready to strike while we debate." A hush fell over the assembly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Gorm's mind raced, weighing the dangers on all sides. After a long moment he spoke, his voice filled with grim determination. "My lords, the choice before us is clear. We cannot afford to split our forces or leave Denmark vulnerable. We must stand united and strong, here on our own shores." Jarl Sigurd sprang to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "You would have us cower here like frightened children while others claim the riches of England? This is not the way of our people." Gorm met Sigurd's gaze steadily. "And what good are riches if we have no home to return to? No, Jarl Sigurd. The old ways of raiding and plunder must give way to a new vision. Denmark will be a nation of traders and builders, not just warriors." The debate raged on into the night, but gradually a consensus began to form. Most of the Jarls saw the wisdom in Gorm's words, though some, like Sigurd, remained unconvinced. As the assembly dispersed, Gorm retreated to his private chambers, exhaustion etched on his face. Thyra followed, concern in her eyes. "You've made a difficult choice, my love," she said softly, "but I believe it's the right one." Gorm sank into a chair, running a hand through his graying beard. "I hope you're right, Thyra, but I fear the consequences of this decision will haunt us for years to come." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a commotion arose outside. Gorm and Thyra rushed to the window to see a crowd gathering in the courtyard below. At its center stood Asgerd the seer. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her body convulsing as if in the grip of some otherworldly force. "Behold!" Her voice rang out unnaturally loud in the winter night. "The threads of fate twist and turn. I see blood on English soil, a crown of thorns, and a sun torn between two worlds." As quickly as it began, the vision passed. Asgerd collapsed, caught by nearby attendants. The crowd buzzed with frightened whispers, trying to interpret the seer's cryptic words. Gorm turned to Thyra, his face pale. What could it mean? Before she could answer, another messenger burst into the room. "My king, my queen," he gasped, out of breath. "A ship has arrived from England. It bears Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, seeking Denmark's aid in avenging their father's death." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Gorm met with Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, listening to their impassioned pleas for Denmark to join their cause. The sons of Ragnar painted vivid pictures of the riches to be won in England, of the glory that awaited those who would avenge their legendary father. But even as he felt the pull of the old ways, the lure of conquest and adventure, Gorm held firm to his vision of a new Denmark. "I am sorry, sons of Ragnar," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Denmark cannot join your great army. Our future lies here, in building a strong and united kingdom." Ivar's face contorted with rage. "You're a coward, Gorm Harathak Knutson. You sit here in your comfortable hall while real men fight and die for glory." Gorm's eyes flashed dangerously. "Watch your tongue, Ivar. You may be the son of a legend, but you stand in the hall of Denmark's king. Our people have seen enough of war and death. It's time we forged a different path." As Ragnar's sons stormed out of Yelling, Gorm couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a powerful enemy. But there was no time to dwell on it. Reports were coming in of Norwegian ships sighted off the coast, and Denmark had to be ready. The next months were a flurry of activity as Gorm marshaled Denmark's defenses. The Jomsvikings, true to their alliance, arrived in force to bolster the Danish army. Coastal watchtowers were reinforced, and every able-bodied man and woman was put to work strengthening fortifications. As spring bloomed across the land, news arrived from England. The great heathen army had met with significant success, carving out large swaths of territory and defeating several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Many in Denmark began to question Gorm's decision to stay out of the conflict. One evening, as Gorm stood atop the walls of Jelling, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of red and gold, young Harold tugged at his cloak. "Father," the boy said, his eyes wide with curiosity, "why didn't we go to fight in England like the other Northmen?" Gorm knelt beside his son, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, Harold, the bravest thing a leader can do is to choose peace over war. Our people have fought and bled for generations. It's time we learn to build rather than destroy." Harold's brow furrowed as he processed this. But what about glory and honor? Don't we need to prove our strength? Gorm smiled sadly, seeing in his son's questions the echoes of his own youthful desires. There are many kinds of strength, my son. The strength to swing a sword is one, but the strength to forge a lasting peace, to build a nation that will endure long after we're gone, that is a far greater challenge. As they stood there, father and son looking out over the land they would one day rule, Gorm felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. He had set Denmark on a new path, one that diverged sharply from the old ways of their Viking ancestors. Only time would tell if it was the right choice. In the years that followed, Denmark prospered under Gorm's rule. Trade flourished, towns grew, and the arts of peace began to take root alongside the traditional warrior culture. But always there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the old ways were not so easily abandoned. Reports continued to come from England of the great heathen army's conquests. Some Danes slipped away to join the fight, drawn by the promise of glory and riches. Gorm knew that each one who left was a silent rebuke to his vision of a new Denmark. And yet, as he watched his son grow, as he saw the first fruits of peace and unity ripening across the land, Gorm held fast to his conviction. Denmark would forge its own path, building a future not on the ruins of conquered lands but on the solid foundation of a united people. The saga of Gorm the Old, the peacemaker king, continued to unfold. And though the road ahead was fraught with challenges both from within and without, the dream of a strong, united Denmark burned bright, a beacon of hope in the turbulent world of the Viking Age. The summer sun beat down on the bustling marketplace of Ribe, Denmark's oldest town. The air was thick with the scent of spices, leather, and the salty tang of the nearby sea. King Gorm, now in his 50s, his beard streaked with gray, moved through the crowd, disguised as a simple merchant. He wanted to see and hear his people without the trappings of royalty coloring their words. As he passed a group of traders, a heated argument caught his attention. "I tell you, the Christian God is the one true deity," a man exclaimed, his face flushed with fervor. "Their priests speak of eternal salvation, of a paradise beyond this mortal realm." His companion scoffed, spitting on the ground. "Nonsense. What of Odin, Thor, and Freya? Are we to abandon the gods of our fathers for this foreign faith?" Gorm frowned, moving closer to listen. The spread of Christianity had been a growing concern in recent years, but he hadn't realized how deeply it had penetrated the common folk. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the docks. Gorm hurried over to find a crowd gathered around two men, one wearing the robes of a Christian priest, the other the traditional garb of a Norse Gothi, or pagan priest. "Your Christ is weak," the Gothi shouted, his face contorted with rage. "Where was he when the great heathen army conquered half of England? Our gods grant us strength and victory." The Christian priest, a younger man with a serene expression, replied calmly, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, my friend. He offers not earthly conquests but eternal peace for the soul." As the argument escalated, Gorm saw hands moving to weapon hilts. He stepped forward, throwing back his hood. "Enough!" he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. The crowd fell silent, many dropping to their knees as they recognized their king. Gorm turned to the two priests, his expression stern. "Is this how men of faith behave? Squabbling like children in the street?" The Gothi bowed his head. "Forgive us, my king, but these Christians seek to undermine our very way of life." The Christian priest spoke up. "We seek only to share the light of God's love, your majesty. Surely there is room for both old and new in Denmark." Gorm sighed heavily, feeling the weight of the crown he wasn't even wearing. "Both of you, come with me. We have much to discuss." Later, in the great hall of Jelling, Gorm sat upon his high seat, Thyra by his side. Before them stood not just the two priests from Ribe, but representatives of both faiths from across Denmark. "My lords," Gorm began, his voice grave, "we stand at a crossroads. The old ways of our fathers and this new Christian faith vie for the souls of our people. I would hear your thoughts on how we might find a path forward that doesn't tear Denmark apart. The debate raged for hours. The followers of the old gods spoke of tradition, of the strength that had seen the Northmen through centuries of hardship. The Christians preached of salvation, of a new moral order that could unite all peoples under one God. As night fell and tempers frayed, Thyra leaned in close to Gorm. "My love," she whispered, "perhaps it's time to seek higher counsel." Gorm nodded, understanding her meaning. He raised his hand for silence. "We will reconvene tomorrow, but first I would have Asgard the seer read the omens. Perhaps the gods themselves, old or new, will provide guidance." The next morning a hush fell over the assembled crowd as Asgard entered the hall. The old Völva's eyes seemed to look beyond the mortal realm as she approached the high seat. "Great king," she intoned, her voice otherworldly, "I have communed with the forces that shape our world. The tide of change cannot be stemmed, but neither can the old ways be fully abandoned. A balance must be struck, lest Denmark be torn asunder." Gorm leaned forward, his heart racing. "What must we do, wise one?" Asgard's eyes locked onto his, piercing in their intensity. "A test, my king. Let the power of both faiths be demonstrated before all. Only then can a true path forward be found." And so it was that on the following day, all of Yelling gathered in the fields outside the town. At one end stood the Gothi, resplendent in ceremonial furs and carrying a staff carved with runes. At the other, the Christian priest, clutching a wooden cross and a book of scriptures. Gorm addressed the crowd, his voice carrying across the field. "People of Denmark, today we seek guidance from powers beyond our mortal understanding. Let both the old gods and the Christian deity show their strength." The Gothi stepped forward first, raising his staff to the sky. He began to chant in the ancient tongue, calling upon Thor to demonstrate his might. The crowd watched in tense silence, many still loyal to the old ways, silently praying for a sign. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a rumble of thunder rolled across the clear sky. A gasp went up from the assembled Danes as a single bolt of lightning struck a nearby oak tree, splitting it in two. The followers of the old gods cheered, but Gorm raised his hand for silence. "And now," he said, "let the Christian God make his power known." The priest stepped forward, trembling slightly, but with faith shining in his eyes. He held aloft his cross and began to pray in Latin, his voice growing stronger with each word. At first it seemed as though nothing would happen. The pagan faction began to jeer, but suddenly a hush fell over the crowd. A beam of sunlight had broken through the clouds, illuminating the priest in a golden glow. As they watched in awe, a white dove descended from the sky, alighting upon the cross in the priest's hands. The crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers, fearful whispers, and confused murmurs. Gorm raised his hands for silence once more. "People of Denmark," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment, "we have witnessed great power from both the old ways and the new. It is clear that neither faith can be dismissed, nor can one fully supplant the other." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces turned towards him. In that moment, he saw the future of Denmark hanging in the balance. "From this day forward," Gorm declared, "Denmark shall walk a path of tolerance. Those who wish to follow the old gods may do so freely. Those who are called to this new Christian faith shall not be persecuted. But know this, above all, we are Danes. Our loyalty to our people and our kingdom must transcend the boundaries of faith." The announcement was met with a mixture of reactions. Some cheered the wisdom of their king, while others grumbled about compromise. But as the crowd dispersed, Gorm could sense a lessening of the tension that had gripped the kingdom. Later that evening, as Gorm and Thyra sat alone in their chambers, the weight of the day's events settled upon them. "Do you think we've done the right thing?" Gorm asked, his voice weary. Thyra took his hand, her touch comforting. "We've done what we must to keep Denmark whole. The path ahead will not be easy, but it is necessary." Gorm nodded, his mind already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. "We must be vigilant. There are those who will seek to exploit this division for their own gain. As if in answer to his words, a knock came at the door. A messenger entered, his face grave. "My king, my queen," he said, bowing low. "We've received word from our allies in Francia. The Normans in Rouen have officially converted to Christianity." Gorm and Thyra exchanged a worried glance. The political landscape of Europe was shifting, and Denmark would need to adapt or risk being left behind. "Thank you," Gorm said to the messenger. "Leave us now." As the door closed, Gorm walked to the window, looking out over the torchlit streets of Jelling. The decision he had made today would shape the future of Denmark for generations to come. He only hoped it would be enough to see them through the turbulent times ahead. "Come, my love," Thyra said softly, joining him at the window. "Tomorrow brings new challenges. We must be rested to face them." As they prepared for bed, Gorm's mind raced with plans and contingencies. The Christian tide was rising across Europe, but Denmark would forge its own path, one that honored its past while embracing the possibilities of the future. The saga of Gorm the Old, the Peacemaker King, had entered a new chapter. The battles ahead would be fought not with swords and axes, but with ideas and faith. And as always, the fate of Denmark hung in the balance. The harsh winter wind howled across the frozen fjords of Denmark, carrying with it the scent of change and the whispers of a passing era. In the great hall of Jelling, now expanded and fortified over the decades of his rule, King Gorm the Old sat upon his high seat, his once fierce eyes clouded with age, his beard now white as the snow outside. At 70 winters, Gorm felt the weight of his years pressing down upon him. His body, once strong enough to swing an axe in battle and swim icy seas, now ached with every movement. But his mind remained sharp, honed by decades of statecraft and the constant challenge of holding a kingdom together. "Father," a strong voice called, drawing Gorm from his reverie. He looked up to see his son, Harold, now a man in his prime, striding towards him. "The Jarls are assembled. They await your words." Gorm nodded, slowly rising to his feet. With Harold's support, he made his way to the great doors of the hall. As they swung open, a hush fell over the assembled nobles of Denmark. "My loyal Jarls," Gorm began, his voice still carrying the authority of a king despite its aged rasp. "I have called you here to speak of Denmark's future. For too long, we have balanced on the knife's edge between the old ways and the new. It is time for us to choose a path forward, one that will secure our place in this changing world." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gorm raised a hand for silence. "I have ruled for many years, striving to bring unity and peace to our lands. But I am old, and the time has come to look to the future. My son, Harold, stands ready to take the crown. But before that day comes, there is one last task I must complete." Gorm's eyes swept the hall, meeting the gaze of each Jarl in turn. "I speak of the Danvirke, the great wall that has protected our southern borders for generations. It must be strengthened, expanded, to stand as a bulwark against the tides of change that threaten to overwhelm us." Jarl Styrbjorn, one of the oldest and most respected nobles, stepped forward. "My king, the Danvirke has served us well, but is it wise to invest so much in a wall of earth and timber when our enemies grow stronger by the day?" Gorm's eyes flashed with a hint of their old fire. "The Danvirke is more than just a wall, Styrbjorn. It is a symbol of our unity, our strength. In building it, we build the future of Denmark itself." As the debate raged on, Thyra, her once golden hair now streaked with silver, approached the high seat. The younger man's face was etched with concern. "Father," Harold said, his voice low, "I've received troubling news from our scouts. The Saxons to the south are massing their forces. They see the construction of the Danvirke as a threat." Gorm's eyes narrowed as he gazed southward. "Let them come," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "They will find Denmark ready to defend what is ours." As if in answer to his words, a horn blast echoed across the countryside. In the distance, the glint of Saxon armor could be seen, an army approaching on the horizon. Gorm turned to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Harold, the time has come for you to prove yourself as a leader. Take command of our forces. Show our people that their future king is worthy of the crown." Harold's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and determination crossing his face. I will not fail you, father." As Harold rushed off to marshal Denmark's defenses, Gorm felt a presence beside him. Asgerd the seer, now ancient and frail, had appeared as if from thin air. "The threads of fate draw tight, Gorm Harathaknutson," she rasped, her cloudy eyes fixed on something beyond mortal sight. "The future of Denmark hangs in the balance. Are you prepared to pay the final price for your vision?" Before Gorm could respond, a cry went up from the Danish lines. The Saxon army had begun its advance, their war cries carrying on the wind. The battle that followed would be sung of in Skald's tales for generations to come. Harold, proving himself every inch his father's son, led the Danish forces with skill and courage. The Danavirka, even in its unfinished state, proved its worth, funneling the Saxon attackers into killing fields where Danish archers and spearmen could decimate their ranks. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, victory seemed within grasp. But then, a group of Saxon berserkers broke through the Danish lines, charging towards the section of the wall where Gorm stood. Time seemed to slow as Gorm watched the attackers approach. He knew in that moment that his life's work, the united Denmark he had fought so hard to build, hung in the balance. Without hesitation, he drew his sword, its weight familiar in his hand despite the years of peace. "For Denmark," Gorm roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield. He met the Saxon charge head-on, his blade flashing in the fading light. The old king fought with a strength that belied his years, each stroke fueled by the love he held for his people and the dream of a better future. But even as he felled foe after foe, Gorm knew that his final battle was upon him. As the last Saxon fell to his blade, Gorm felt a searing pain in his side. He looked down to see a Saxon spear protruding from his ribs, its shaft slick with his blood. Harold's anguished cry cut through the din of battle. "Father, no!" As Gorm collapsed, his lifeblood staining the earth of the Danevirk, he saw his son fighting his way towards him, cutting down any Saxon foolish enough to stand in his path. With his last strength, Gorm grasped Harold's hand as the younger man knelt beside him. "My son," he gasped, "the future of Denmark is in your hands now. Remember, unity is our strength. The old and the new must find balance." As the light faded from Gorm's eyes, a great keening went up from the Danish army. The Saxons, seeing their opportunity lost and their forces decimated, began to retreat. In the days that followed, as Denmark mourned the loss of Gorm the Old, Harold was crowned king before the assembled jarls and chieftains. Standing atop the completed section of the Danavirka, with Thera by his side and Asgerd's prophecies echoing in his mind, Harold addressed his people. "My father gave his life for this wall, for the dream of a united Denmark," he declared, his voice carrying to every ear. "I swear by all that is holy, both old gods and new, that I will see his vision fulfilled. Denmark will stand strong, a beacon of unity in a fractured world." As the cheers of the assembled Danes echoed across the countryside, the saga of Gorm the Old, the peacemaker king, came to an end. But the legacy he left behind, a Denmark poised between old and new, tradition and progress, would shape the course of history for centuries to come. And atop the Danevirke, where Gorm had made his final stand, a great runestone was raised. Its inscription, carved deep into the living rock, would stand as a testament to the dream of a king who dared to imagine a different future for his people. Gorm, son of Harthacnut, first king of all Denmark, raised this wall. May it stand as long as Danes love freedom and cherish unity. The longship's dragon-headed prow cut through the mist-shrouded waters of the North Sea, its sail billowing with the promise of home. At the helm stood Bjorn Ironside, his weathered hands gripping the tiller, eyes fixed on the distant shoreline of Norway. The voyage from England had been long and treacherous, but the weight of gold and silver in the ship's hold made it worthwhile. As the familiar cliffs of the fjord came into view, Bjorn called out to his crew, "Make ready, we approach Vestfold." The men, weary from weeks at sea, stirred to life. Among them was Halfdan, Bjorn's childhood friend and right-hand man. He approached Bjorn, his face etched with concern. "Something troubles you, Halfdan?" Bjorn asked, noting his friend's furrowed brow. Halfdan nodded, his voice low. "Aye, it's about what we saw in Northumbria. The Christian monks, their strange rituals. It's not sitting right with me." Bjorn's jaw tightened. He too had been unsettled by their encounters in England. "We'll speak of it later," he muttered, turning his attention back to guiding the ship into the harbor. As they docked, a crowd gathered on the shore. Families rushed to greet returning warriors, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Bjorn leaped onto the dock, scanning the faces for his father, Jarl Erik. Instead, he was met by Thorstein, his father's steward. The older man's face was grim. "Welcome home, Bjorn. Your father awaits you in the great hall. There's news." Bjorn's heart quickened. "What news, Thorstein? Speak plainly." Thorstein glanced around nervously. "It's best heard from the Jarl himself. But know this, times are changing, and not all welcome it." With a nod to Halfdan to oversee the unloading, Bjorn strode towards the great hall, his mind racing. The village seemed different somehow, quieter, more subdued. He noticed a small wooden cross hanging from one doorway, an alien sight in this land of Thor and Odin. The great hall loomed before him, its carved pillars telling stories of gods and heroes. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and tension. Jarl Erik sat in his high seat, his once powerful frame now bent with age and worry. Beside him stood a woman Bjorn had never seen before, her silver hair and piercing blue eyes marking her as someone of importance. "Father," Bjorn said, dropping to one knee. "I've returned." Jarl Erik's eyes softened at the sight of his son. "Rise, Bjorn. We have much to discuss." He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Astrid, a Völva from the north. She brings visions." Astrid's gaze fell upon Bjorn, and he felt as if she were peering into his very soul. "So," she said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "the wayward son returns. Tell us, young Ironside, what news do you bring from Christian lands?" Bjorn hesitated, aware of the many ears listening. "England is changing, Father. The Christian God gains strength there. Many of the old sacred groves have been cut down, replaced by stone churches." A murmur ran through the hall. Jarl Erik leaned forward, his voice low. "And here, my son, the winds of change blow as well. Olaf Tryggvason has returned to Norway, claiming kingship and bringing with him the White Christ." Bjorn's blood ran cold. He had heard tales of Olaf, a fearsome warrior, now turned zealot. "What does this mean for us, Father?" Before the Jarl could answer, Astrid spoke, her eyes unfocused as if seeing beyond the hall's smoky confines. "I have seen it in the threads of fate. The Nornir weave a tapestry of blood and faith, the old gods grow restless, and Yggdrasil itself trembles." Silence fell over the hall, broken only by the crackling of the central fire. Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. "What would you have me do, Father?" Jarl Erik stood, his voice ringing out with authority. "We must prepare. Olaf moves swiftly, gaining support in the coastal regions. He speaks of one kingdom, united under his god. But we are of the old blood, and we will not bend easily." As if summoned by the Jarl's words, the doors of the hall burst open. A young warrior, bloodied and breathless, staggered in. "My Jarl, news from the south. King Olaf's men, they've destroyed the great temple at Lade." Chaos erupted in the hall. Men shouted for vengeance, while others called for caution. Bjorn watched as his father struggled to maintain order, the lines of worry deepening on his face. Amidst the tumult, Astrid's voice cut through like a blade. "Silence," she commanded. and the hall obeyed. The destruction of one temple is but the beginning. I have seen a great serpent rising from the sea, its coils threatening to crush all of Norway. Old and new, pagan and Christian, all will be tested in the days to come. Bjorn felt a chill run down his spine. He thought of the Christian monk he had spoken with in England, of the peace and certainty the man seemed to possess. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, what if there was truth in this new faith? As if reading his thoughts, Astrid fixed her gaze upon him once more. You, Bjorn Ironside, stand at a crossroads. The choices you make in the coming days will shape the fate of all Norway. Jarl Erik placed a hand on Bjorn's shoulder. My son, I need you now more than ever. Olaf will seek to sway the young and the ambitious. You must be our strength, our link to the old ways. Bjorn nodded, though doubt gnawed at his heart. I will not fail you, father, nor our gods. As the hall erupted into plans and preparations, Bjorn found himself drawn to a window overlooking the fjord. The mist had lifted, revealing a sky painted in hues of fire. A storm was brewing on the horizon. Halfdan appeared at his side, his voice low. What are you thinking, my friend? Bjorn's hand went to the hammer of Thor that hung at his neck. I'm thinking that everything is about to change, Halfdan, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. Halfdan clapped him on the back. Whatever comes, we'll face it together, as we always have. As night fell over Vestfold, Bjorn found himself unable to sleep. The words of Astrid the Völva echoed in his mind, mingling with memories of England and the strange new god who seemed to be reaching out across the sea to ensnare even mighty Norway. In the distance, thunder rumbled, Thor's hammer or the Christian god's wrath. Bjorn could no longer be certain. One thing was clear: the age of Vikings was entering its twilight, and the dawn that followed would reveal a world forever changed. The autumn sun hung low over the fjord, its weak light barely penetrating the mist that clung to the shoreline. Bjorn Ironside stood at the edge of the water, watching as a fleet of longships appeared on the horizon. The dragon-headed prows seemed to pierce the veil between worlds, harbingers of the change that was about to sweep across Norway. They're here, Halfdan said, his voice tight with apprehension. Bjorn nodded grimly. Olaf Tryggvason comes to Vestfold. May the gods protect us all. As the ships drew closer, the beach came alive with activity. Jarl Erik had ordered a grand welcome for the self-proclaimed King of Norway, hoping to gauge the man's intentions before deciding on a course of action. The lead ship ground against the shingle, and a tall figure leapt onto the shore with the agility of a man half his age. Olaf Tryggvason stood before them, his golden hair and beard gleaming in the pale sunlight. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the assembled crowd before settling on Jarl Erik. Hail, Jarl of Vestfold! Olaf's voice boomed across the beach. I come seeking your fealty and that of your people. Norway shall be united under one crown and one god. Jarl Erik stepped forward, his face a mask of careful neutrality. Welcome, Olaf Tryggvason. Vestfold offers you hospitality, as is our custom. Come, let us speak in the great hall. As the two leaders made their way inland, followed by their retinues, Bjorn exchanged a worried glance with Halfdan. This will not end well, he muttered. Halfdan gripped the hilt of his sword. Perhaps not, but it will end in blood, one way or another. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with tension. Olaf sat in the place of honor, his Christian priests flanking him, their robes a stark contrast to the furs and leather of the Norse warriors. Jarl Erik raised his drinking horn. To peace and prosperity in Norway, he said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. Olaf smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. To a united Norway, under the one true God, he countered, taking a deep draught. The negotiations that followed were tense, with Olaf making it clear that he expected not just political allegiance, but religious conversion as well. The old gods have served us well, Jarl Erik argued. Why should we abandon them? Olaf leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Because they are false, Eric. There is but one God, and he offers salvation to all who believe. Your Norse gods are demons, leading you to damnation. A murmur of anger rippled through the hall. Bjorn felt his hand instinctively move to his weapon, but a sharp look from his father stayed him. You speak of salvation, Jarl Erik said carefully, but I see only the threat of the sword behind your words. Olaf's smile was cold. The sword can open the way for the cross, Erik. It has done so before, and it will do so again if necessary. As the day wore on, it became clear that Olaf would not leave without some concession. In the end, Jarl Erik reluctantly agreed to allow Christian missionaries to preach freely in Vestfold, in exchange for a degree of autonomy. As night fell, Bjorn found himself unable to sleep. The events of the day weighed heavily on his mind. He slipped out of the longhouse and made his way to the sacred grove on the outskirts of the village. To his surprise, he found Astrid the Völva already there, standing before the great oak that served as the heart of the grove. She turned as he approached, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "The threads of fate draw tight, young Ironside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have seen what is to come, and it fills me with dread." Bjorn stepped closer, drawn by the intensity of her words. "What have you seen, Völva? Tell me." Astrid closed her eyes, swaying slightly as if caught in a trance. "I see a land divided, brother against brother, father against son. I see the old gods fading, their power waning as the new god's influence grows. And I see—" She paused, her eyes snapping open with a look of terror. "I see Jormungandr stirring in the depths, awakened by the chaos above." Bjorn felt a chill run down his spine. The world serpent, whose thrashing would herald Ragnarok, the end of all things. "Surely it cannot be," he breathed. Astrid gripped his arm, her nails digging into his flesh. "You must be prepared, Bjorn Ironside. The choices you make in the coming days will shape the fate of all Norway." Before Bjorn could respond, a noise from the edge of the grove caught their attention. A figure stumbled into the clearing. It was Leif, one of the younger warriors of the village. "Bjorn! Völva!" Leif gasped, out of breath. "You must come quickly. There's been an incident in the village." They rushed back to find a scene of chaos. A crowd had gathered around the shrine of Thor, where the god's hammer had stood for generations. Now, the shrine lay in ruins, the hammer broken and defaced. Jarl Erik stood before the desecrated shrine, his face a mask of fury. Beside him, Olaf Tryggvason looked on with an expression of feigned concern. "Who is responsible for this sacrilege?" Jarl Erik roared. One of Olaf's priests stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I am, Jarl. I could not stand by and watch as your people worshipped a false idol. The one true God demands—" He got no further. With a cry of rage, one of the Norse warriors lunged forward, his axe flashing in the torchlight. The priest's words ended in a gurgle as blood sprayed from his throat. For a moment, everyone stood frozen in shock. Then, with a roar, Olaf's men drew their weapons. The Norse warriors responded in kind, and suddenly the night was filled with the clash of steel and the screams of the wounded. Bjorn found himself in the thick of the melee, his sword singing as he defended his people. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of Olaf, a whirlwind of destruction, his own blade claiming Norse lives with terrifying efficiency. As quickly as it had begun, the skirmish was over. Bodies littered the ground, both Norse and Christian. Olaf stood over the fallen, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. "This," he declared, his voice carrying over the groans of the wounded, "is what comes of clinging to false gods. But it is not too late. Renounce your pagan ways, embrace the true faith, and such bloodshed need never happen again." Jarl Erik, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, straightened to his full height. "You bring war in the guise of peace, Olaf Tryggvason. Vestfold will not bow to your god or your crown. Leave now, before more blood is spilled." For a moment it seemed Olaf might press the attack. But then, with a curt nod, he signaled his men to withdraw. "This is not the end, Erik. he said as he turned to leave. "Norway will be united, in this life or the next." As Olaf and his forces retreated to their ships, Bjorn helped his father back to the Great Hall. The night's events had shaken him to his core. "What now, father?" he asked as they tended to their wounds. Jarl Eric's eyes were hard as flint. "Now, my son, we prepare for war. Olaf will not stop with Vestfold. We must rally the other Jarls, those who still hold to the old ways. The future of Norway hangs in the balance." As dawn broke over the fjord, painting the sky in hues of fire, Bjorn stood once more at the water's edge. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and he knew in his heart that the harvest would be bitter indeed. Halfdan joined him, his face grim. "Dark days ahead, my friend." Bjorn nodded, his hand unconsciously touching the hammer of Thor that hung at his neck. "Aye, dark days indeed. But we are Norse. We do not fear the storm. We are the storm." As they turned back to the village, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, neither man noticed the ripple in the fjord's calm waters, a ripple that seemed to come from the depths, as if something ancient and terrible were stirring from its long slumber. The wind howled through the fjords of Vestfold, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the distant clangor of steel. 2 moons had passed since Olaf Tryggvason's fateful visit, and Norway was a land divided. Reports filtered in daily of skirmishes between the followers of the old gods and the adherents of the White Christ. Bjorn Ironside stood atop a hill overlooking the great temple of Thor, the last bastion of the old faith in the region. His father, Jarl Erik, had fortified the sacred site, knowing it would be a prime target for Olaf's crusade. "They come," Halfdan said, pointing to the horizon where a column of dust betrayed the approach of a large force. Bjorn's jaw clenched. "So it begins. Sound the alarm." As the horn blasts echoed across the valley, the defenders of the old ways rushed to their positions. Bjorn made his way to the temple steps where his father stood, grim-faced and resolute. "Remember, son," Jarl Erik said, his voice low. "This is more than just a battle for land or power. This is a fight for our very way of life, for the souls of our people." Bjorn nodded, feeling the weight of Thor's hammer against his chest. "I understand, father. We will not fail our gods." As Olaf's army came into view, Bjorn was struck by its size and composition. Alongside the king's warriors marched priests in their dark robes, carrying crosses and chanting in a foreign tongue. At the forefront rode Olaf himself, resplendent in gleaming armor, a great sword at his side. The Christian force halted just beyond arrow range. A tense silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then Olaf urged his horse forward, alone, stopping halfway between the 2 armies. "People of Vestfold," his voice boomed across the field. "I come not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Cast aside your false idols and embrace the true God. Do this, and you shall know peace and salvation." Jarl Erik stepped forward, his own voice strong despite his years. "We know your kind of peace, Olaf Tryggvason. It is the peace of the grave, bought with the blood of those who dare to think differently. We will not abandon our gods or our ways." A murmur of agreement rose from the Norse defenders. Olaf's face darkened with anger. "Then you choose damnation," he growled. Turning his horse, he galloped back to his lines. No sooner had he reached them than the Christian army surged forward with a great cry. Bjorn raised his sword, roaring, "For Thor, for Odin, for Norway." The 2 forces crashed together in a maelstrom of violence. Bjorn found himself in the thick of the fighting, his sword a blur of motion as he cut down one Christian warrior after another. Beside him, Halfdan fought with equal ferocity, his axe rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. Through the chaos of battle, Bjorn caught glimpses of the larger conflict unfolding. He saw his father, Jarl Erik, holding the center of the line, his experience and skill making up for his advancing years. On the flanks, Norse berserkers threw themselves at the enemy with reckless abandon, their battle frenzy striking terror into the hearts of Olaf's men. But the Christians fought with the zeal of the converted. Their priests moved among them, offering blessings and exhortations, spurring them to greater efforts. And always at the forefront was Olaf, a whirlwind of destruction, his sword claiming Norse lives with terrifying efficiency. As the sun reached its zenith, the battle hung in the balance. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the ground between the armies was slick with blood and littered with the fallen. Suddenly, a great cry went up from the Christian lines. Bjorn turned to see a group of Olaf's men breaking through the Norse defenses, heading straight for the temple. At their head was a priest, carrying a flaming torch. "No!" Bjorn roared, fighting his way towards the temple. But the press of battle was too thick, the distance too great. Time seemed to slow as Bjorn watched the priest reach the temple steps. With a cry of triumph, he hurled the torch at the ancient wooden structure. In moments, flames began to lick up the sides of the building, feeding on the dry timber. A collective wail of anguish rose from the Norse defenders at the sight of their sacred place burning. Jarl Erik, his face a mask of fury and grief, rallied his men for one last, desperate charge. "To me, sons of Norway," he cried, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Let us send these Christian dogs back to their foreign god." The Norse warriors surged forward with renewed vigor, catching Olaf's men off guard. Bjorn found himself fighting alongside his father, their swords rising and falling in unison as they cut a path through the enemy ranks. For a moment it seemed as though the tide of battle might turn. But then, through the smoke and chaos, Bjorn saw Olaf himself bearing down on them, his eyes blazing with fanatical zeal. "Father, look out!" Bjorn cried, but his warning came too late. Olaf's sword flashed in the sunlight, finding a gap in Jarl Erik's armor. The old warrior stumbled, his face a mask of shock and pain. Bjorn caught his father as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. "No, no, no," Bjorn muttered, pressing his hand against the wound in a futile attempt to stem the flow of blood. Jarl Erik grasped his son's arm, his voice weak but urgent. "Bjorn, you must lead our people now. Don't let our ways die." With a final shuddering breath, Jarl Erik, last defender of the old faith in Vestfold, passed into the halls of Valhalla. A red mist descended over Bjorn's vision. With a roar of grief and rage, he hurled himself at Olaf, their swords meeting in a shower of sparks. The two men fought with inhuman intensity, each the avatar of their respective faiths. But even as they dueled, the battle around them was turning. The loss of Jarl Erik and the destruction of the temple had broken the spirit of the Norse defenders. Slowly but surely, they began to fall back. Halfdan appeared at Bjorn's side, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Bjorn, we must retreat. The day is lost." For a moment, Bjorn was tempted to ignore his friend, to fight on until he fell beside his father. But then he remembered Jarl Erik's last words. He had a responsibility to his people. With a final, hate-filled glare at Olaf, Bjorn disengaged from the fight. "Fall back," he shouted to the remaining defenders. "Fall back to the hills." As they retreated, Bjorn looked back one last time. The great temple of Thor, centerpiece of their faith for generations, was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. And before it stood Olaf Tryggvason, his sword raised in triumph, the cross gleaming on his armor. That night, in a hidden valley deep in the forests of Vestfold, the survivors of the battle gathered around flickering campfires. The mood was somber, the air thick with grief and uncertainty. Bjorn stood before them, his father's cloak draped over his shoulders, the weight of leadership heavy upon him. "We have lost a battle," he said, his voice carrying to every ear, "but not the war. Our gods have not abandoned us. They test us as they tested our ancestors, and like our ancestors, we will emerge stronger." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Halfdan stepped forward, raising his voice. "What is our plan, Bjorn? Where do we go from here?" Bjorn's eyes gleamed with determination in the firelight. "We go north, to join with other jarls who still hold to the old ways. We will gather our strength, and when the time is right, we will return. Olaf Tryggvason may think he has won, but this is far from over." As the survivors prepared for their journey north, Bjorn stood apart, gazing up at the star-filled sky. He thought of his father, of the burning temple, of the clash of faiths that threatened to tear Norway apart. "Give me strength," he whispered to the gods above. "Give me wisdom, for the road ahead is dark, and I fear the greatest challenges are yet to come." In the distance, thunder rumbled. Thor's hammer or the Christian god's wrath, Bjorn could no longer be certain. But he knew one thing: the clash of faiths had only just begun, and the fate of Norway hung in the balance. The harsh winter winds howled across the fjords of Trøndelag, where Bjorn Ironside and his band of refugees had found temporary sanctuary. 3 moons had passed since the fall of Vestfold, and the pain of loss still burned fresh in their hearts. The longhouse of Jarl Håkon, a staunch ally of the old ways, provided shelter from the biting cold and Olaf's advancing forces. Bjorn stood at the edge of the fjord, his breath misting in the frigid air. The weight of leadership hung heavy on his shoulders, made all the more burdensome by the absence of his father's guidance. "You'll freeze if you stay out here much longer," a gentle voice said behind him. Bjorn turned to see Ingrid, the Jarl's daughter, approaching with a thick fur cloak. Her golden hair gleamed in the weak winter sunlight, and her blue eyes held a warmth that seemed to defy the surrounding cold. "Thank you," Bjorn said, accepting the cloak gratefully. "I hadn't noticed the cold." Ingrid stood beside him, gazing out over the icy waters. "You carry much on your mind, Bjorn Ironside. Perhaps sharing the burden would ease it?" For a moment, Bjorn was tempted to brush off her concern, but something in Ingrid's eyes, a genuine compassion, broke through his defenses. "I fear for our people," he admitted. "Olaf's forces grow stronger by the day, and many are swayed by the promises of his new god. How can we stand against such a tide?" Ingrid placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Faith, Bjorn, faith in our gods, in our people, and in yourself. That is how we will endure." As they spoke, a commotion arose from the village. Halfdan came running towards them, his face flushed with excitement. "Bjorn! A ship approaches. It bears the banner of Astrid the Völva." Hope surged in Bjorn's chest. Astrid's visions had guided them in the past. Perhaps she brought news that could turn the tide of their struggle. The longship glided into the harbor, its sail bearing the image of Yggdrasil, the world tree. As Astrid disembarked, Bjorn was struck by how much older she seemed, as if the weight of her visions had aged her beyond her years. "Hail, Bjorn Ironside," Astrid called, her voice carrying the authority of the gods themselves. "The Norns have shown me much since last we met. Come, we must speak in private." In Jarl Håkon's private chambers, Astrid revealed the purpose of her journey. Her eyes glazed over as she spoke, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "I have seen a great serpent stirring in the depths," she intoned. "Jörmungandr awakens, roused by the chaos that plagues our land. The clash between the old gods and the new threatens to tear the very fabric of our world asunder." Jarl Håkon's face paled. "Surely it cannot be Ragnarok. Not now, when we are so divided." Astrid shook her head. "The final battle is not yet upon us, but its shadow looms. There is a way to avert this fate, but it requires a great sacrifice." All eyes turned to Bjorn. He straightened, ready to bear whatever burden the gods demanded. "What must be done?" Astrid fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "You must journey to the heart of enemy territory, to Nidaros itself. There, in Olaf's stronghold, lies an ancient artifact, the Horn of Heimdallr. With it, we can calm the world serpent and buy time for our people." Bjorn's mind reeled at the enormity of the task. Nidaros was Olaf's seat of power, heavily guarded and teeming with Christian converts. It would be akin to walking into the lair of Fenrir himself. "It's suicide," Halfdan protested. "We'd never make it past the city gates, let alone find this horn." But Bjorn saw the necessity of the mission. "If this is what the gods demand, then I will answer their call. But I'll not order any man to follow me on such a perilous journey." To his surprise, Ingrid stepped forward. "I will go with you," she said, her voice firm. "I know Nidaros well. My uncle was a merchant there before Olaf's conversion. I can guide you through the city." Jarl Håkon began to protest, but Ingrid silenced him with a look. "Father, you've trained me as a shield maiden since I could hold a sword. Let me use those skills for our people." Halfdan sighed dramatically. "Well, I can't very well let you two have all the fun. Count me in." As preparations for the journey began, Bjorn found himself drawn to the Temple of Thor. The small wooden structure paled in comparison to the great temple of Vestfold, but it still provided a connection to the gods. He knelt before the statue of Thor, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across the god's stern visage. "Give me strength," Bjorn whispered. "Give me wisdom, for the path ahead is fraught with danger, and I fear the cost of failure." A hand on his shoulder startled him from his reverie. He turned to find Ingrid standing behind him, her expression solemn. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. Bjorn shook his head. "Not at all. I was just seeking guidance." Ingrid knelt beside him, her eyes fixed on the statue of Thor. "My father says you're a man of great faith, Bjorn, that you never waver in your devotion to the old gods." There was something in her tone that gave Bjorn pause. "You sound uncertain." Ingrid sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I've heard the Christian priests speak, Bjorn. Their words, they offer comfort, the promise of eternal peace. Sometimes I wonder." Bjorn felt a flicker of alarm. "You've been listening to Olaf's missionaries?" "Not intentionally," Ingrid hurried to explain. "But their words carry on the wind. And I can't help but think, what if they're right? What if our gods are just stories?" For a moment, Bjorn was at a loss for words. The idea that Ingrid, daughter of one of the staunchest defenders of the old faith, could harbor such doubts was shocking. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw not betrayal but genuine confusion and fear. "Ingrid," he said gently, taking her hand in his, "our gods are as real as the ground beneath our feet, as the sky above our heads. They've guided our people for generations through storm and strife. The Christians may promise peace, but at what cost? The loss of our identity, our very way of life." Ingrid's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "But how can you be so certain?" Bjorn smiled, squeezing her hand. "Faith, Ingrid, the same faith you spoke of earlier. It's not always easy, but it's what defines us. And on this journey, we'll need that faith more than ever." As they left the temple, Bjorn couldn't shake a sense of unease. Ingrid's doubts were a stark reminder of the challenge they faced, not just from Olaf's armies, but from the allure of his new god. The next morning, as dawn broke over the fjord, Bjorn, Ingrid, and Halfdan prepared to depart. A small crowd had gathered to see them off, including Jarl Håkon and Astrid the Vulva. "Remember," Astrid said, her voice low and urgent, "the Horn of Heimdallr is more than just a relic. It's a key to our survival. But beware, its power may come at a great price." Jarl Håkon embraced his daughter fiercely. "Be safe, my child. And you, Bjorn Ironside, I entrust you with my greatest treasure. Bring her back safely, or answer to me in Valhalla." As they boarded the small, nondescript fishing boat that would carry them south, Bjorn felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This journey would test not just their strength and cunning, but their very faith. Halfdan, ever the optimist, grinned as he took up the oars. "Well, my friends, shall we go beard the Christian lion in his den?" As the boat slipped out of the harbor and into the open sea, Bjorn cast one last look at the receding shoreline. The fate of their people, perhaps of all Norway, rested on the success of their mission. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the sky in hues of fire, Bjorn sent up a silent prayer to the gods. "Odin, Thor, Freya, guide our path. For the road ahead is dark, and the trials of the heart may prove our greatest challenge yet." With that, they set their course for Nidaros, the stronghold of Olaf Tryggvason, where danger and destiny awaited. The small fishing boat bobbed precariously on the choppy waters of the Norwegian Sea. For 5 days, Bjorn, Ingrid, and Halfdan had battled against treacherous currents and biting winds, their progress towards Nidaros painfully slow. As dawn broke on the 6th day, an ominous rumble echoed across the waters, sending a chill down Bjorn's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Did you hear that?" Ingrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Halfdan nodded grimly, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a look of concern. "Aye, and I've never heard thunder quite like it." Bjorn scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a dark mass of clouds gathering in the distance. "Storm's coming. We need to find shelter, and fast." As if in response to his words, the sea began to churn more violently. Waves crashed against the sides of their small vessel, threatening to capsize it at any moment. Ingrid and Halfdan worked frantically to bail out water, while Bjorn struggled with the rudder, trying to keep them on course. Suddenly, a massive wave rose before them, towering over their tiny boat like a mountain of water. Bjorn's eyes widened in disbelief as he saw something moving within the wave, something impossibly large and serpentine. "By the gods," he breathed. "It can't be." The wave crashed down upon them with devastating force. For a heart-stopping moment, Bjorn was submerged, tumbling through the icy water. When he finally broke the surface, gasping for air, he found himself clinging to a piece of the shattered boat. "Ingrid!" he shouted, searching desperately for his companions. "Halfdan!" A hand grasped his arm, and he turned to see Ingrid beside him, her golden hair plastered to her face. "I'm here," she coughed. "But where's Halfdan?" A moment later, Halfdan's head bobbed up nearby. "I'm alive," he sputtered, "though I think I swallowed half the sea." As they clung to the debris, fighting to stay afloat in the turbulent waters, another rumble shook the air. This time it was accompanied by a sight that made Bjorn's blood run cold. Rising from the depths, a massive serpentine form breached the surface. Scales the size of shields glistened in the dim light, and eyes like molten gold fixed upon the 3 humans adrift in its domain. "Jörmungandr," Ingrid whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. "The Midgard serpent. It's real." The great beast regarded them for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, with a motion that sent waves rippling across the sea, it began to sink back beneath the surface. "Look!" Halfdan shouted, pointing towards the horizon. "Land!" Through the mist and spray, Bjorn could make out the faint outline of a coastline. "We have to swim for it," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's our only chance." The swim to shore was a battle against exhaustion, and the ever-present fear that Jörmungandr might return to finish what it had started. By the time they dragged themselves onto the rocky beach, all 3 were on the verge of collapse. As they lay on the shore, catching their breath, Bjorn's mind raced. The appearance of Jörmungandr was more than just a brush with death. It was a sign. Astrid's warnings about the world serpent stirring had been all too real. "What does it mean?" Ingrid asked, voicing the question that hung in the air. Bjorn pushed himself to his feet, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar coastline. "It means we're running out of time. We need to find Nidaros, and quickly." As they made their way inland, the devastation wrought by Jörmungandr's awakening became apparent. Villages lay in ruins, their buildings crushed as if by a giant hand. The few survivors they encountered spoke of a great wave that had swept away everything in its path. In one such village, they found temporary shelter in the remains of a longhouse. As night fell, Bjorn kept watch while Ingrid and Halfdan tried to rest. "You should sleep," Ingrid said softly, coming to sit beside him. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." Bjorn shook his head, his eyes fixed on the distant sea. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those golden orbs staring back at me." Ingrid placed a hand on his arm, her touch a comfort in the darkness. "What you did out there, saving us, it was incredible. You truly are blessed by the gods." For a moment, Bjorn allowed himself to feel the warmth of her praise. But then a pang of guilt shot through him. Am I? If I were truly blessed, I would have foreseen this. I would have been able to protect our people back in Vestfold. Ingrid's grip on his arm tightened. Bjorn, look at me. When he met her gaze, she continued. You can't blame yourself for what happened. Olaf's betrayal, Jormungandr's awakening. These are forces beyond any one person's control. What matters is how we face them. Her words struck a chord within him, and Bjorn found himself drawing strength from her conviction. You're right, he said, managing a small smile. Thank you, Ingrid. I'm glad you're here with me. A moment of understanding passed between them, charged with something more than just camaraderie. But before either could speak further, Halfdan's voice cut through the night. Hate to interrupt this touching moment, he said, his tone unusually serious, but we've got company. Bjorn and Ingrid sprang to their feet, weapons at the ready. Through the broken walls of the longhouse, they could see torchlight approaching, a group of armed men making their way through the village. Olaf's men? Ingrid whispered. Bjorn nodded grimly. Likely searching for survivors, or looters. Either way, we can't risk being discovered. They slipped out of the longhouse using the shadows and debris for cover, but as they reached the edge of the village, a shout went up behind them. There! Stop in the name of King Olaf! Run! Bjorn yelled, and the three of them sprinted into the forest. The chase was frantic, a mad dash through unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness. Branches whipped at their faces, and unseen roots threatened to trip them at every step. But the sounds of pursuit drove them onward, fear lending speed to their tired limbs. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath Bjorn's feet. He tumbled down a steep embankment, coming to a jarring stop at the bottom. Dazed, he looked up to see Ingrid and Halfdan sliding down after him. Are you all right? Ingrid asked, helping him to his feet. Before Bjorn could answer, a low growl emanated from the darkness around them. As his eyes adjusted, he realized they had stumbled into a cave, and they were not alone. Emerging from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the faint moonlight filtering through the cave entrance, was a massive bear. The beast reared up on its hind legs, towering over them. Nobody move, Bjorn whispered, his hand inching towards his sword. But Ingrid stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. Great spirit of the forest, she said, addressing the bear. We seek your protection. Hunters pursue us, those who would destroy the old ways. Grant us sanctuary, and we will honor you with song and story. For a heart-stopping moment, the bear remained motionless, its hot breath visible in the cool air. Then slowly, it lowered itself back to all fours and retreated deeper into the cave. By Thor's hammer, Halfdan breathed. I can't believe that worked. Ingrid turned to them, a look of wonder on her face. The old magic still lives. The gods have not abandoned us. As if to confirm her words, the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. Their hunters had lost the trail. Exhausted but grateful for their narrow escape, the three companions made their way deeper into the cave. As they settled in for the night, using moss and leaves to create makeshift bedding, Bjorn found himself pondering the events of the day, the appearance of Jormungandr, their miraculous survival, and now this encounter with the bear spirit. It all pointed to a world in flux, where the boundaries between the mortal realm and the domain of gods and monsters were growing thin. We're close now, he said softly, more to himself than to his companions. Nidaros can't be far, and with it, the horn of Heimdallr. As sleep finally claimed him, Bjorn's dreams were filled with visions of serpents and bears, of stormy seas and golden horns, and through it all a sense of urgency pulsed like a heartbeat. Time was running out. The fate of Norway, perhaps of all Midgard, hung in the balance. In the depths of the cave, as the three fugitives slept, the bear watched over them with ancient knowing eyes, and far out at sea, beneath the turbulent waves, Jormungandr coiled and uncoiled, its stirring sending tremors through the very foundations of the world. The Midgard serpent was awake, and the final battle approached. but whether it would herald the end of all things or the dawn of a new age remained to be seen. For Bjorn, Ingrid, and Halfdan, the greatest challenges and choices still lay ahead. Dawn broke over Nidaros, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The city, once a bastion of Norse tradition, now stood as the heart of Olaf Tryggvason's Christian kingdom. Crosses adorned the tops of buildings where Thor's hammer once hung, and the air rang with the sound of church bells rather than the clash of swords in practice yards. Bjorn, Ingrid, and Halfdan crouched behind a low stone wall on a hill overlooking the city. Their journey had been fraught with danger, but they had finally reached their destination. "There," Ingrid whispered, pointing to a large structure near the center of Nidaros. "That's the Great Hall. If the Horn of Heimdallr is anywhere, it'll be there." Bjorn nodded, his eyes scanning the streets below. "The city's on edge. Look at the patrols, the fortifications. Olaf's expecting trouble." Halfdan grinned, though his eyes remained serious. "Well, my friends, we'd best not disappoint him." As they discussed their plan of entry, a commotion in the city square caught their attention. A large crowd was gathering, drawn by the sound of heated voices. "We should check it out," Bjorn decided. "Whatever's happening might provide the distraction we need." Disguised in cloaks they'd taken from a farmstead on their journey, the three made their way into the city. The press of bodies in the square made it easy to blend in, and soon they found themselves at the edge of a makeshift stage. On one side stood a group of Christian priests, led by a tall, austere man with piercing blue eyes. On the other, to Bjorn's surprise, were several Norse Gothi, priests of the old faith. At the center of the stage stood King Olaf himself, his golden hair and beard gleaming in the morning light. "People of Nidaros," Olaf's voice boomed out over the crowd. "For too long has our land been divided by matters of faith. Today, we settle this once and for all. Let the priests of the old ways and the new present their arguments, and let the truth be known." A murmur ran through the crowd. Bjorn exchanged glances with Ingrid and Halfdan. This was unexpected, a public debate between the faiths. The Christian priest stepped forward first. "Good people of Nidaros," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "For too long have you lived in darkness, bound by the chains of false gods and superstition. But there is one true God, all-powerful and all-loving, who offers salvation to all who believe." He went on to speak of Christ's sacrifice, of eternal life, and of a kingdom not of this world. His words were eloquent, and Bjorn could see many in the crowd nodding in agreement. When the priest finished, one of the Norse Gothi stepped forward. He was an old man, his beard white as snow, but his eyes burned with the fire of conviction. "Hear me, children of Norway." The Gothi's voice rang out, surprisingly strong for one so aged. "These Christians speak of one God, but we know the truth of many. Odin the All-Father, Thor the Protector, Freya the Life-Giver. These are not distant figures, but the very essence of our world." He spoke of the gods' deeds, of their presence in every aspect of Norse life, from the thunder in the sky to the fertility of the fields. "Our gods do not promise an easy path to salvation," he concluded, "but a life of honor, courage, and meaning. They are the bedrock upon which our culture is built." As the debate raged on, Bjorn found himself drawn in despite the urgency of their mission. The Christian priests spoke of peace and eternal life, while the Gothi emphasized strength, honor, and the continuity of Norse traditions. Beside him, Ingrid listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. Bjorn remembered her doubts back in Trøndelag and wondered how this debate was affecting her. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the crowd, a voice Bjorn recognized with a jolt. "Let someone who has lived both faiths speak." The crowd parted, and a figure strode towards the stage. Bjorn's heart raced as he recognized the weathered face and keen eyes of his old friend Eric the Red. Eric climbed onto the stage, facing the crowd. "I am Eric Thorvaldsson, called the Red. I have sailed to distant lands, founded colonies, and seen the workings of both the old gods and the new. And I tell you this, there is truth in both. A hush fell over the square as Eric continued. The Christian God offers comfort and the promise of peace. Our Norse gods offer strength and the courage to face life's battles. But in the end, it is not the gods who shape our fate, but our own actions. His words seemed to strike a chord with many in the crowd. Even Olaf leaned forward, listening intently. We stand at a crossroads, Eric declared. The world is changing, and we must change with it. But change does not mean abandonment. We can embrace the new while honoring the old. It is not the name of the God we worship that matters, but the values we uphold. As Eric's speech concluded, the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and heated discussions. Bjorn turned to his companions, his mind racing. "This is our chance," he whispered urgently. "With everyone distracted, we can slip into the great hall." Halfdan nodded, already moving. "I'll create a diversion. You two find the horn." Before Bjorn could protest, Halfdan had melted into the crowd. Moments later, a commotion broke out on the far side of the square, Halfdan's work, no doubt. Bjorn and Ingrid used the confusion to slip away, making their way towards the great hall. As they approached, Bjorn noticed Ingrid's troubled expression. "What's wrong?" he asked as they ducked into an alleyway. Ingrid bit her lip, her eyes conflicted. "It's just Eric's words and the debate. What if we're wrong, Bjorn? What if this conflict is pointless?" Bjorn placed his hands on her shoulders, meeting her gaze. "Ingrid, listen to me. This isn't just about which god to worship. It's about our way of life, our traditions, our very identity. Olaf doesn't just want to change our faith, he wants to erase everything that makes us who we are." Ingrid nodded slowly, some of the doubt leaving her eyes. "You're right. We have to see this through." They made their way into the great hall, slipping past guards distracted by the commotion outside. The interior was a strange blend of Norse and Christian symbolism. Crosses hung beside tapestries depicting the gods, and biblical scenes were carved next to images of Yggdrasil. As they searched for any sign of the Horn of Heimdallr, voices approached from a nearby corridor. Bjorn and Ingrid quickly ducked behind a large tapestry. "The debate is a success, my king," a voice said, the Christian priest from earlier. "The people are receptive to the new faith." "Perhaps," Olaf's voice replied, sounding troubled. "But Eric the Red's words worry me. If the people try to blend the faiths, we'll never truly break free from the old ways. Then we must take more decisive action," the priest said, his tone chilling. "The old temples that remain must be destroyed, the Gothi who resist must be dealt with, and the Horn of Heimdallr." Bjorn's breath caught in his throat. They were on the right track. "Yes," Olaf agreed. "It must be destroyed. Its power is too great, too tied to the old ways. Prepare the ritual. We'll melt it down at dawn, and with it, break the last link to the pagan past." As the voices faded, Bjorn and Ingrid emerged from their hiding place, exchanging grim looks. "We're out of time," Bjorn said. "We have to find the horn tonight." Ingrid nodded, her face set with determination. "And we have to warn the others. If Olaf goes through with his plans, it'll be the end of everything we fought for," Bjorn finished. As they resumed their search with renewed urgency, Bjorn's mind raced. The fate of Norway, of their entire way of life, now hung by a thread. The Horn of Heimdallr was their last hope of awakening the people to the threat they faced, of calming Jörmungandr's stirrings, and of preserving the connection to their gods and ancestors. But with dawn approaching and Olaf's plans in motion, the battle for the soul of Norway was reaching its climax. And Bjorn knew that before the sun rose, he would be forced to make choices that would shape the fate of his people for generations to come. The great hall seemed to loom around them, filled with shadows and secrets. Somewhere within its walls lay the key to their salvation, or their doom. And as Bjorn and Ingrid pressed on, the weight of destiny settled heavily upon their shoulders. The battle for souls had begun, and the very foundations of Midgard trembled in anticipation of its outcome. The great hall of Nidaros was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Bjorn and Ingrid moved silently through its corridors, every sense alert for signs of the Horn of Heimdallr or approaching danger. The debate in the square outside had ended, and an uneasy quiet had settled over the city. "We're running out of time," Ingrid whispered, her eyes darting from one darkened alcove to another. "Dawn can't be far off." Bjorn nodded grimly. "We need to find Halfdan. He might have learned something during the commotion." As they rounded a corner, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing Bjorn's arm. He reacted instantly, drawing his knife, only to find himself face to face with Halfdan. "Easy there, my friend," Halfdan grinned, though his eyes were serious. "I've got news, and you're not going to like it." Quickly and quietly, Halfdan relayed what he'd overheard while mingling with the crowd. Olaf's men were preparing for a purge of the remaining Norse loyalists in the city. Worse, there were rumors of a traitor among the Old Faith supporters, someone high up in the resistance. "A traitor?" Ingrid's face paled. "But who would betray our cause?" Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. The three friends ducked into an alcove, holding their breath as a group of guards passed by. "In the old treasury," one guard was saying. "King Olaf wants it moved before dawn for the ritual." As the guards' voices faded, Bjorn exchanged a significant look with his companions. "The old treasury, that must be where they're keeping the horn." With renewed purpose, they made their way deeper into the heart of the Great Hall. The old treasury, once a storehouse for the wealth of Norse kings, now lay abandoned and nearly forgotten in the bowels of the building. As they approached the heavy oak door of the treasury, Bjorn held up a hand, signaling for silence. From within, they could hear muffled voices. "Cannot go through with this, my king," a familiar voice was saying. With a jolt, Bjorn recognized it as Eric the Red. "Destroying the horn will only inflame the resistance." "Enough!" Olaf's voice cut through, sharp with anger. "You've played your part well, Eric. The people trust you. But do not forget where your true loyalties lie." Bjorn felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. Eric the Red, the man he had admired, whose words had swayed the crowd. A traitor. Beside him, Ingrid's face was a mask of shock and betrayal. Halfdan's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "We trusted him," Ingrid whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "How could he do this?" Bjorn's mind raced. The revelation of Eric's betrayal changed everything. But they couldn't afford to let shock paralyze them, not when they were so close to their goal. "We stick to the plan," he said, his voice low and determined. "The horn is in there. We have to get it, no matter what." With a nod to his companions, Bjorn kicked open the door. The scene that greeted them was one of frozen tableau. Olaf and Eric stood over a small chest, their faces masks of surprise. Between them, gleaming in the torchlight, was the horn of Heimdallr. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, everything happened at once. Halfdan charged towards Olaf, his sword flashing. Ingrid knocked an arrow, aiming at the guards who were belatedly springing into action. And Bjorn found himself face to face with Eric the Red. "Bjorn," Eric said, his voice heavy with regret. "I had hoped you wouldn't be involved in this." "Why, Eric?" Bjorn demanded, circling the older man. "You were a hero to our people. How could you betray everything we stand for?" Eric's eyes flashed with a mixture of pain and determination. "You don't understand, boy. The old ways are dying. Olaf offers a chance for peace, for unity. Sometimes, to save a people, you have to let go of the past." Their swords met with a resounding clash. Around them, the treasury had erupted into chaos. Halfdan was engaged in a furious duel with Olaf, while Ingrid's arrows kept the guards at bay. As Bjorn and Eric traded blows, the younger warrior couldn't help but admire the older man's skill. Eric the Red was a legend for a reason, his sword moving with a speed and precision that belied his years. "It doesn't have to be this way," Eric grunted, parrying a thrust from Bjorn. "Join us, help build a new Norway, one that can stand against the tides of change sweeping Europe." For a moment Bjorn hesitated. Eric's words stirred the doubts that had plagued him since the fall of Vestfold. But then he remembered his father, remembered the burning temple, remembered the vision of Jörmungandr rising from the sea. "No," Bjorn said, his voice firm. "Our ways are God's. They're not just stories, Eric. They're the foundation of who we are. I won't let them be erased." With a surge of strength, Bjorn pressed his attack. His blade moved in a complex pattern, a technique his father had taught him long ago. Eric's eyes widened in recognition, but it was too late. With a final, decisive strike, Bjorn disarmed the older warrior. Eric fell to his knees, his sword clattering to the ground. "Finish it, then," he said, looking up at Bjorn with a mixture of defeat and pride. But Bjorn shook his head. "No, you'll face the judgment of our people. All of our people." A cry of pain drew Bjorn's attention. Halfdan had been wounded, a deep gash on his arm allowing Olaf to press his advantage. Without hesitation, Bjorn leapt to his friend's aid. The two friends fought back to back, their blades a whirlwind of steel against Olaf and his remaining guards. Ingrid's arrows continued to find their marks with deadly accuracy. In the midst of the melee, Bjorn caught sight of the horn of Heimdallr. It lay forgotten on the floor, having fallen from its chest during the fight. With a desperate lunge, he dove for it. His hand closed around the cool metal just as Olaf's blade descended towards his head. But before the killing blow could land, an arrow thudded into Olaf's shoulder, causing him to stumble back with a cry of pain. Bjorn looked up to see Ingrid, her bow still raised, a fierce light in her eyes. "Go!" she shouted. "Get the horn out of here. We'll hold them off." Heart pounding, Bjorn scrambled to his feet. He cast one last look at his friends, Halfdan, bleeding but unbowed, and Ingrid, fierce as a Valkyrie, before turning to run. But as he reached the door, a hand grasped his arm. It was Eric. "Wait," the older man gasped, his face pale. "There's something you need to know. The horn, it's more than just a relic, it's..." His words were cut off as an axe buried itself in his back. Eric's eyes widened in shock, then dimmed as he slumped to the ground. Bjorn looked up to see Olaf, his face contorted with rage, reaching for another weapon. There was no time left. "Bjorn, run!" Halfdan's voice cut through the chaos. With a last anguished look at his friends, Bjorn turned and fled, the horn of Heimdallr clutched tightly to his chest. He ran through the twisting corridors of the great hall, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Guards shouted, and alarm bells began to ring throughout Nidaros. As he burst out into the pre-dawn air, Bjorn realized the full weight of what had just transpired. They had the horn, but at what cost? Halfdan and Ingrid were still inside, possibly captured or worse. Eric the Red, once a hero, had died a traitor's death before revealing some crucial secret about the horn. And now, with Olaf's men surely scouring the city, Bjorn found himself alone, clutching an artifact of immense power that he didn't fully understand. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky, Bjorn made a decision. He couldn't leave his friends behind, but neither could he allow the horn to fall back into Olaf's hands. Whatever Eric had been about to reveal, whatever power the horn held, Bjorn knew it was the key to everything, to calming Jörmungandr, to preserving their way of life, to saving Norway itself. With a heavy heart, he turned away from the great hall and towards the docks. He would find a way to rescue Halfdan and Ingrid, but first, he had to secure the horn. As he moved through the awakening city, blending in with the early morning crowds, Bjorn sent up a silent prayer to the gods. Odin, Thor, Freya, give me strength. The fate of our people rests in my hands, and I cannot fail. The horn of Heimdallr thrummed with power against his chest, as if in response to his plea. And in the distance beyond the fjord, thunder rumbled, a reminder that greater forces were at work, and that the final battle for the soul of Norway was far from over. As Bjorn disappeared into the labyrinth of Nidaros' streets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of Midgard. The shadows of betrayal had been cast, but from them, a new hope had emerged, carried in the hands of a young warrior with the weight of his people's destiny upon his shoulders. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. Bjorn Ironside stood at the prow of a small fishing boat, his eyes fixed on the distant shoreline of Trondheim. The horn of Heimdallr was secured beneath his cloak, its weight a constant reminder of the burden he carried. 3 days had passed since his narrow escape from Nidaros. 3 days of hiding, of calling in old favors, of gathering what remained of the resistance, and 3 days of gnawing worry for Halfdan and Ingrid, left behind in Olaf's clutches. As the boat approached the shore, Bjorn could see figures gathering on the beach. He recognized the bear-like form of Jarl Hakon, leader of the last major holdout against Olaf's rule. "Bjorn Ironside," Hakon's voice boomed across the water. "By Odin's eye, we'd thought you lost." As soon as his feet touched the sand, Bjorn was engulfed in a bone-crushing embrace. But the reunion was short-lived. Hakon's face grew serious as he took in Bjorn's haggard appearance and the absence of his companions. "Come," the Jarl said, leading Bjorn towards a cluster of tents set back from the shore. "We have much to discuss and little time to do it." Inside the largest tent, a war council was already in session. Grizzled warriors and weathered shamans huddled around a crude map of Norway, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. "Tell us everything," Håkon commanded once they were seated. Bjorn recounted the events in Nidaros, the debate, Eric's betrayal, the fight for the horn, and the fate of Halfdan and Ingrid. As he spoke, he could see the hope dying in the eyes of those around him. "So," an old warrior named Ulf growled, "we've lost our greatest hero to treachery, and 2 of our best young fighters are in Olaf's hands. Some victory this is." Bjorn's hand went to the horn concealed beneath his cloak. "Not all is lost. We have this." As he revealed the horn of Heimdallr, a collective gasp went up from the assembly. Its surface seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, runes etched along its length pulsing with an inner fire. "The horn," Hakon breathed. "But do you know how to use it? What power it truly holds?" Bjorn hesitated. "Eric, he tried to tell me something about it, at the end. But he was killed before he could finish." A murmur of disappointment ran through the tent. But before despair could take hold, a new voice spoke up. "I may be able to help with that." All eyes turned to the entrance of the tent. There, leaning heavily on a staff, stood Astrid the Völva. Her eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, now held a misty, faraway look. "Astrid!" Bjorn exclaimed, rushing to support the old seeress. "We thought you lost in the flight from Vestfold." Astrid allowed herself to be led to a seat, her ancient bones creaking with each movement. "Lost? No, young Ironside. Hidden, perhaps. Waiting. The Norns have shown me much in my absence." The tent fell silent as Astrid's gaze fell upon the horn. "Heimdallr's horn," she murmured. "The Gjallarhorn. It is said that when blown, it can be heard throughout all the worlds, from the depths of Helheim to the heights of Asgard. But how does that help us now?" Ulf demanded. "Unless you propose we call the gods themselves to fight our battles." Astrid's eyes flashed, a hint of her old fire returning. "Fool, the horn is more than just an instrument of sound. It is a bridge between worlds, a key to unlocking the very fabric of reality." She turned to Bjorn, her voice taking on a prophetic tone. "You, Bjorn Ironside, must take the horn to Yggdrasil itself. There, at the heart of the World Tree, you must sound the horn. Its call will awaken the ancient powers, calm the stirring of Jörmungandr, and rally all of Norway to our cause." A heavy silence fell over the tent as the weight of Astrid's words sank in. It was Håkon who finally spoke. "Yggdrasil? But that's just a myth, a story we tell our children. How can Bjorn possibly—" "It is real," Astrid interrupted. "As real as the ground beneath our feet. The gateway lies in the heart of the great forest to the east, guarded by powers older than even the gods themselves." Bjorn's mind reeled with the implications. A journey to the heart of the World Tree, to the very center of creation. It seemed impossible, yet he knew in his heart that Astrid spoke the truth. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm despite the fear churning in his gut. "But what of Halfdan and Ingrid? We can't abandon them to Olaf's mercy." Håkon placed a hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "We'll mount a rescue. While you journey to Yggdrasil, we'll muster what forces we have left and strike at Nidaros. With luck, we'll free your friends and buy you the time you need." As the war council erupted into a flurry of planning, Bjorn stepped outside the tent. The night air was cool on his face, and in the distance, he could hear the crashing of waves against the shore. Above, the stars glittered like shards of ice in the velvet sky. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear Astrid approach until she spoke. "You carry a heavy burden, young Ironside." Bjorn turned to face the Velva. "How can I do this, Astrid? I'm no hero, no chosen one. I'm just me." Astrid's weathered hand grasped his arm with surprising strength. "It is precisely because you are just you that you must do this. The gods do not choose perfect vessels, Bjorn. They choose those with the strength to bend without breaking, to face impossible odds with courage and determination." Her eyes seemed to look through him into some distant future only she could see. "The twilight descends, Bjorn Ironside. Ragnarok approaches, but whether it heralds the end of all things or the birth of a new world, that depends on you." As if to punctuate her words, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. But when Bjorn looked up, he saw not storm clouds, but a shimmering curtain of light, the aurora, dancing across the heavens in sheets of green and gold. "The gods are watching," Astrid whispered. "They await your next move." With a new resolve hardening in his heart, Bjorn gripped the horn of Heimdallr. "Then let's not keep them waiting. We leave for Yggdrasil at first light." As dawn broke over Trondheim, a small band of warriors gathered on the beach. Bjorn stood at their center, the horn secured at his side, his father's sword on his hip. Håkon and his men were preparing for their desperate assault on Nidaros, while a select few would accompany Bjorn on his quest for Yggdrasil. "Remember," Astrid said as they prepared to depart, "the path to the Vol.3 will be fraught with dangers both physical and spiritual. Trust in the gods, trust in each other, and above all, trust in yourself, Bjorn Ironside." With final embraces and solemn oaths, the two groups parted ways. As Bjorn led his companions into the dense forests to the east, he cast one last look over his shoulder. The rising sun glinted off the fjord, and for a moment he thought he saw a massive serpentine form moving beneath the waves. Jormungandr was stirring, the twilight of the gods was descending, and the fate of Norway, of all Midgard, now rested on the shoulders of a young warrior with an ancient horn and an unshakable determination. As they plunged into the shadowy depths of the forest, Bjorn sent up a silent prayer. "Odin, Thor, Freya, guide our steps, for the road ahead is dark, and the future of our people hangs in the balance." The horn of Heimdallr thrummed at his side, as if in answer to his plea. And deep in the heart of the forest, ancient powers began to stir, awakening to the approach of one who would change the course of destiny. The twilight was descending, but whether it would give way to eternal night or the dawn of a new age remained to be seen. For Bjorn Ironside and his companions, the greatest test of their faith, their courage, and their very souls lay ahead. The ancient forest loomed before Bjorn and his small band of warriors, its depths shrouded in mist and shadow. They had been traveling for days, following Astrid's cryptic directions towards the heart of Yggdrasil. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the weight of ancient magic and forgotten lore. "Are you certain we're going the right way?" Gunnar, one of the younger warriors, asked nervously. His eyes darted from tree to tree, as if expecting trolls or Jötnar to leap out at any moment. Bjorn's hand instinctively went to the horn of Heimdallr at his side. "Astrid's visions have never led us astray before. We must have faith." As if in response to his words, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the trees. The group froze, hands flying to weapons. "Wolves?" Helga, a shield maiden with eyes like flint, asked quietly. Bjorn shook his head, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "No, something worse." From the shadows emerged a pack of monstrous wolves, their eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. At their head stood a beast larger than a horse, its fur as black as night. Fenrir, Bjorn breathed, recognizing the great wolf of legend. The massive wolf regarded them with ancient, hungry eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like gravel scraping against bone. Children of Midgard, you trespass in realms beyond your understanding. Bjorn stepped forward, mustering every ounce of courage he possessed. Great Fenrir, we seek passage to Yggdrasil. The fate of all worlds hangs in the balance. Fenrir's laugh was a terrible thing, sending shivers down the spines of even the bravest warriors. And why should I care for the fate of worlds that would see me bound? Why should I not devour you where you stand? For a moment, Bjorn was at a loss. How could one reason with a being of such primal chaos? Then an idea struck him, an idea. Because, he said slowly, we offer you a chance at revenge. This caught Fenrir's attention. The great wolf's ears pricked forward. Speak quickly, mortal. My patience wears thin. Bjorn took a deep breath. Ragnarok approaches, but it comes not as the prophecies foretold. A new god seeks to usurp the old order, to rewrite the very fabric of our world. Help us reach Yggdrasil, and you strike a blow against those who would see you chained for eternity. For a long moment, Fenrir was silent, considering Bjorn's words. Then, to everyone's shock, the great wolf began to laugh, a sound like avalanches and splitting glaciers. Well played, son of Midgard. You have a silver tongue to match your iron will. Fenrir's massive head lowered until it was level with Bjorn's. I will grant you passage, but know this, should you fail in your quest, I will hunt you and yours to the ends of creation. With that ominous promise, Fenrir and his pack melted back into the shadows, leaving the path ahead clear. As they pressed on, the forest grew stranger. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, their bark inscribed with runes that shifted and changed when viewed from different angles. The very air seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Look, Helga suddenly cried out, pointing ahead. There, in a clearing bathed in ethereal light, stood an enormous ash tree. Its trunk was wider than 100 men standing shoulder to shoulder, and its branches reached up beyond sight, disappearing into the clouds above. Yggdrasil, Bjorn whispered in awe. The world tree. As they approached, they saw that the trunk was not wood, but a swirling vortex of energy, images of different realms flickering within its depths. Now what? Gunnar asked, his voice hushed with reverence. Before Bjorn could respond, a familiar voice rang out. Now, young Ironside, you face your greatest test. From behind the massive trunk stepped Odin himself, the All-Father, in all his terrible glory. His single eye blazed with the wisdom of ages, and ravens perched upon his shoulders. Bjorn and his companions fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the god's presence. Rise, Odin commanded. There is no time for obeisance. Ragnarok's shadow looms, and the fate of all hangs by a thread. As they stood, Bjorn found his voice. All-Father, we have brought the horn of Heimdallr. We were told its power could calm Jörmungandr and rally Norway against the foreign god. Odin's eye fell upon the horn, and for a moment something like sadness passed across his ageless face. The horn is indeed powerful, but its true nature is not what you believe. To use it is to set in motion events that cannot be undone. A chill ran down Bjorn's spine. What do you mean? The horn of Heimdallr is not merely an instrument of sound, Odin explained. It is a key that can unlock the barriers between worlds. To blow it here at the heart of Yggdrasil would not just be heard throughout the 9 worlds. It would tear open the very fabric of reality. The implications hit Bjorn like a physical blow. But that would mean Ragnarok, Odin finished grimly. Not as a distant prophecy, but as an immediate reality. The giants would pour forth from Jotunheim. The dead would rise from Helheim. and Jormungandr would awaken fully, bringing about the doom of gods and men alike. Despair threatened to overwhelm Bjorn. Had they come all this way, faced so many trials, only to find that their solution would bring about the very catastrophe they sought to prevent? But then he thought of Halfdan and Ingrid, still captive in Nidaros. He thought of his father, of the burning temples, of Olaf's crusade to erase their very way of life. "Is there no other way?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Odin's eye seemed to pierce through to Bjorn's very soul. "There is always a choice, son of Midgard. But know this, whatever you decide will shape the fate of all worlds for ages to come." The Allfather waved his hand, and suddenly the air around them shimmered. Images appeared, visions of possible futures. In one, Bjorn saw Norway united under Olaf's rule, the old ways forgotten, their gods fading into myth. In another, he saw his people clinging to their traditions but isolated, a dying culture in a changing world. And in a third, he saw chaos. Fire and ice, giants battling gods, the world tree itself trembling. But beyond the destruction, there was a glimmer of something else. A new world, rising from the ashes of the old. "The choice is yours, Bjorn Ironside," Odin said solemnly. "Preserve the old order and watch it slowly fade. Embrace the new and lose who you are. Or risk everything on the hope that from Ragnarok's fires, a better world might be born." Bjorn's mind raced. The weight of worlds pressed down upon him. He thought of Astrid's prophecies, of Eric's betrayal, of the stirring of ancient powers. And he thought of his people, not just those who clung to the old ways, but all Norsemen, caught between worlds, struggling to find their place. With trembling hands, he raised the horn of Heimdallr to his lips. "I choose hope," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose to believe in our people, in our gods, in the strength that has seen us through 1,000 winters." He turned to his companions, seeing in their eyes the same mix of fear and determination that he felt in his heart. "Whatever comes, we face it together, as we always have." Odin nodded, a fierce pride gleaming in his eye. "Then sound the horn, son of Midgard. Let Ragnarok come, and may the Norns weave a fate worthy of your courage." Bjorn took a deep breath. The cool metal of the horn pressed against his lips. In that moment he saw flashes of all that had led him to this point. His father's lessons, Ingrid's unwavering faith, Halfdan's loyal friendship, the burning temples, the rise of Olaf, the stirring of Jormungandr. And then, with a prayer to all the gods and a hope for the future yet to be born, Bjorn Ironside blew the horn of Heimdallr. The sound that erupted was beyond anything mortal ears had ever heard. It shook the very foundations of Yggdrasil, echoing through all 9 worlds. The trunk of the world tree split open, reality itself seeming to fracture. As the sound faded, an eerie silence fell. Then, from the depths of the cosmos, came an answering roar. Jormungandr, the world serpent, fully awakening from its slumber. Odin's voice cut through the chaos, filled with both sorrow and pride. "And so it begins. Ragnarok is upon us. Fight well, children of Midgard, for in your hands now rests the fate of all creation." As the skies darkened and the earth trembled, Bjorn Ironside stood tall, his companions at his side, ready to face whatever came next. The final battle loomed, and with it, the chance to forge a new destiny for gods and men alike. Ragnarok's shadow had fallen, but within that darkness, a spark of hope still burned, a hope kindled by the courage of those who dared to challenge fate itself. The world trembled on the brink of chaos. The sound of the horn of Heimdallr still echoed through the 9 worlds, and the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. Bjorn Ironside stood at the foot of Yggdrasil, the world tree, surrounded by his small band of warriors. The air crackled with otherworldly energy, and the sky above had turned a sickly green, shot through with veins of lightning. "What have we done?" Gunnar whispered, his face pale with fear. Before Bjorn could respond, The ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. In the distance, a terrible roar split the air. Jörmungandr, the world serpent, fully awakened and on the move. "We've set in motion the end of all things," Bjorn said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. And with it, the chance for a new beginning. Odin, the All-Father, still stood before them, his single eye blazing with an intensity that was almost painful to behold. "The time for doubt is past," he declared. "Now is the hour of battle, of glory, of fate. The Jötnar march from Jötunheim, the dead rise from Helheim, and the gods themselves prepare for war." As if summoned by his words, the air shimmered, and suddenly the clearing was filled with divine presence. Thor, the Thunderer, his mighty hammer Mjolnir crackling with lightning. Freya, the Vanadis, her beauty terrible and radiant. Tyr, the one-handed god of war, his face grim with determination. "My son," Thor boomed, striding towards Bjorn. "You have called us to battle." We answer. Bjorn felt overwhelmed by the presence of the gods, but he steeled himself. There was no time for awe or fear. "Great Thor, we need your strength." Jörmungandr stirs, and Olaf's forces still hold Nidaros. Our people are caught between these two dooms. Freya stepped forward, her eyes filled with ancient wisdom. "The mortals speak true, Thunderer. This Ragnarok is not as the prophecies foretold. A new god seeks to usurp the old order, to rewrite the very story of our worlds." Tyr nodded grimly. "Then we must fight on two fronts. Against the giants and the forces of chaos, yes, but also against this usurper who would unmake all that we are." Odin raised Gungnir, his mighty spear, and the air itself seemed to part before it. "So be it. Thor, take the mortal warriors and face Jörmungandr. Tyr, rally the Einherjar and hold back the tide of giants. Freya, use your satyr to shield Midgard as best you can." The All-Father turned to Bjorn, his gaze piercing. "And you, Bjorn Ironside, you must return to Nidaros, end Olaf's reign and reclaim the heart of Norway. For if Midgard falls to the White Christ while we battle the forces of chaos, all will be for naught." Bjorn's mind reeled at the enormity of the task before him. "But how can I hope to stand against Olaf's armies? I am just one man." A smile, fierce and proud, crossed Odin's face. "You are more than just a man, Bjorn Ironside. You are the spark that has ignited Ragnarok, the hope of your people, the bridge between old ways and new. And you do not stand alone." With a wave of his hand, Odin opened a portal in the air. Through it, Bjorn could see the fjords of Norway, and upon them, a vast fleet of longships. "Your call has been heard, not just by gods and giants, but by every soul who still holds to the old ways. They come now, from every corner of the Norse world, to stand with you in this final battle." Bjorn's heart swelled with a mixture of pride, hope, and fear. He turned to his companions, seeing in their eyes the same tumult of emotions. "Are you with me?" he asked, his voice carrying over the growing sounds of cosmic battle. Helga stepped forward, her shield raised. "To victory or Valhalla?" Gunnar nodded, fear replaced by determination. "For Norway. For our gods." With a final nod to Odin and the assembled gods, Bjorn and his warriors stepped through the portal. They emerged on the deck of a longship, at the head of a fleet that stretched as far as the eye could see. Warriors from every Norse settlement, from Iceland to the Orkney Islands, had answered the call of the horn. As they sailed towards Nidaros, the sky above them was a battlefield of mythic proportions. Thor soared overhead, Mjolnir swinging in great arcs as he battled the colossal form of Jörmungandr. The world serpent's scales gleamed like oil-slick metal, its movement sending tidal waves crashing against the shores. On the horizon, Bjorn could see the towers of Nidaros. Smoke rose from the city, and even at this distance he could hear the clash of steel and the cries of battle. "Halfdan and Ingrid," he murmured. "Hold on, we're coming." As the fleet approached the harbor of Nidaros, they were met with a sight both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Olaf's forces were arrayed along the shore, their armor gleaming with the symbol of the cross. But they were not facing the incoming Norse fleet. Instead, they battled against a horde of Draugr, the undead warriors risen from their barrows at the sound of the horn. "By the gods," Gunnar breathed, "it truly is the end of days." Bjorn gripped the side of the ship, his eyes scanning the chaos before them. "No," he said firmly. "It's the forging of a new day, one we will shape with our own hands." As they disembarked, the battle engulfed them. Bjorn fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of motion as he cut through Olaf's men and Draugr alike. Around him, the Norse warriors who had answered the horn's call fought with equal ferocity, their battle cries rising above the din of combat. Through the melee, Bjorn caught sight of a familiar face, Håkon, the Jarl who had sheltered them in Trondheim. The old warrior was bloodied but unbowed, rallying a group of fighters near the city gates. "Håkon!" Bjorn called out as he fought his way to the Jarl's side. "Where are Halfdan and Ingrid?" Håkon's face was grim as he dispatched a Draugr with a mighty swing of his axe. "In the great hall with Olaf. We've been trying to break through, but his guard is too strong." Determination set like iron in Bjorn's heart. "No more. This ends now." Gathering a small group of the fiercest warriors, Bjorn led a charge towards the great hall. The very air seemed to resist their progress, thick with the energies of Ragnarok. Above them, the battle between Thor and Jormungandr raged on, each clash of Mjolnir against serpent scales sending shockwaves through the city. As they approached the great hall, a figure emerged from the smoke and chaos, Olaf Tryggvason himself. The king's armor was dented and bloodied, but his eyes burned with fanatical zeal. "So," Olaf called out, his voice carrying over the sounds of battle, "the pagan dog returns. Have you come to witness the triumph of the one true God?" Bjorn stepped forward, his sword held ready. "I've come to end this madness, Olaf. Look around you. The world stands on the brink of destruction, and still you cling to your crusade?" For a moment, doubt seemed to flicker in Olaf's eyes as he took in the scene of mythic carnage around them, but then his resolve hardened. "This is merely the last gasp of your false gods. When the dust settles, there will be only one God, one kingdom, one truth." With a roar, Olaf charged. "Let us face this doom together, as one people." For a long moment, Olaf said nothing. Then slowly he nodded. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps there is room for both old and new." As word of Olaf's surrender spread, the fighting in the city began to die down. Norse and Christian alike turned their attention to the greater threat, the forces of chaos still rampaging through their lands. Bjorn looked to the sky, where Thor still battled Jormungandr. The world serpent was weakening, but at a terrible cost. The land was ravaged, the sea boiled, and the very air seemed to burn. "What now?" Ingrid asked, coming to stand beside him. "How do we stop this?" Bjorn's hand went to the horn of Heimdallr, still at his side. "We don't stop it," he said, a plan forming in his mind. "We reshape it." Raising the horn to his lips once more, Bjorn blew. But this time, the sound that emerged was not one of awakening or destruction. It was a call of unity, of hope, of a future yet to be written. The sound washed over the battlefield, over all of Norway, over the 9 worlds themselves. And as it did, a change began to take place. The Draugr crumbled to dust. The Jotnar retreated, and Jormungandr, with one final earth-shaking roar, sank beneath the waves. As the sound of the horn faded, a new silence fell over Nidaros. The sky cleared, and the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon. Bjorn looked around at the gathered warriors, Norse and Christian, mortal and divine. "The old world has ended," he declared. "But we are still here. Now is the time to build something new, something that honors both where we've come from and where we're going." Ingrid took his hand, her eyes shining with hope and determination. "A new age," she said. "One we'll shape together." As the sun rose over Nidaros, casting its light on the battered but unbroken city, Bjorn Ironside stood tall. The horn of Heimdallr had called forth Ragnarök, but it had also heralded the dawn of a new age. An age where old and new could coexist, where the wisdom of the past could guide the innovations of the future. The battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. And as Bjorn looked out over the gathered people of Norway, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as one people, forged in the fires of Ragnarök and tempered by the dawn of a new day.